In the heart of West Africa, where the Niger River curves like a golden serpent through endless horizons of sand and grass, there once stood an empire that commanded the very pathways of commerce and learning. Here, beneath skies that stretched, infinite and blue, caravans heavy with salt and gold wound their way across landscapes painted in amber and ochre. The wind carried whispers of distant cities where scholars debated beneath star-filled nights, where the call to prayer echoed. Across markets, bustling with merchants from lands beyond imagination. This is the story of Songhai, an empire that rose like the sun over the Sahel, casting its shadow across centuries and continents, leaving echoes that still dance on desert winds today. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts just like yours. Long before empires dreamed of conquering the world, before the great trade routes carved their paths across the Sahara, the Niger River flowed through the heart of West Africa like a lifeline connecting earth to sky. Its waters, dark and mysterious, carried the hopes and dreams of countless generations who looked upon its banks as home. Here, where the river curved in a great bend eastward toward the rising sun, small communities of fishermen, farmers, and traders had gathered for centuries. Their lives intertwined with the rhythm of flooding seasons and the eternal dance between water and land. The Soko people were among the first to understand the river's secrets. With hands skilled in crafting vessels from the sturdy keiled rat tree, they fashioned boats that could navigate the Niger's changing moods. Their canoes, sleek and graceful, glided through waters that reflected the infinite African sky, carrying not just people and goods, but stories, songs, and the accumulated wisdom of ages. These river folk became the veins through which the region's lifeblood flowed, connecting distant villages and establishing the networks that would one day support an empire. Alongside the Soko lived the Gao people, hunters whose reputation for courage and skill echoed far beyond their riverside settlements. They understood the language of the wild creatures that populated the Niger's waters, the mighty hippopotamus and the ancient crocodile, beasts that commanded both fear and respect. The Gao hunters learned to read the subtle signs of nature, to anticipate the movements of their quarry, and to approach their dangerous prey with the patience and wisdom that would later characterize their empires. Approach to conquest and diplomacy. The people brought yet another element to this emerging civilization, the ancient art of agriculture. In the fertile lands that bordered the Niger, they cultivated crops that would feed growing populations and create the surplus necessary for trade and urban development. Their understanding of the river's seasonal floods, their knowledge of which lands would yield the richest harvests, and their techniques for maximizing agricultural output became the foundation upon which greater ambitions could be built. As generations passed, these diverse groups began to share not only the river's bounty but also its language and customs. The Songhai tongue became the common currency of communication, binding together communities that had once existed in isolation. This linguistic unity was more than mere convenience. It represented a deeper transformation, the birth of a people who would look beyond their individual villages toward grander horizons. They began to call themselves Songhai, taking their name from the very language that united them, and their homeland became known by the same designation by the 10th century. The settlement of Gao had emerged as a focal point for this growing Songhai identity. Positioned strategically where several trade routes converged with the Niger River, Gao became more than just another river town. It evolved into a crossroads where cultures met, where goods changed hands, and where ambitious men began to dream of power that extended far beyond the river's banks. The town's markets buzzed with activity as traders from the north brought salt from the great mines of the Sahara, while those from the south offered gold that gleamed like captured sunlight. The early rulers of Gao understood that their position gave them a unique opportunity. They were not merely kings of a single town or tribe, but guardians of a crucial link in the emerging trans-Saharan trade network. This realization shaped their approach to governance and expansion, leading them to think not in terms of controlling territory alone, but of managing the flow of commerce and ideas that passed through their domain. They began to levy taxes on passing caravans, to provide protection for merchants, and to establish the diplomatic relationships that would allow trade to flourish even in times of regional conflict. The Mali Empire, growing ever more powerful to the west, took notice of Gao's increasing prosperity and strategic importance. Around 1300, Malian forces moved eastward, incorporating Gao into their vast dominion. For more than a century, the Songhai found themselves subjects of Mali's Mansas, their destiny seemingly tied to the fortunes of an empire whose capital lay hundreds of miles away. Yet this period of subjugation was not without its benefits. Under Malian rule, Gao's merchants gained access to trade networks that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mediterranean, while the town's artisans learned new techniques and absorbed influences from across West Africa. During these years of Malian dominance, the Songhai people began to develop the administrative and military skills that would later serve them well. They observed how the Mali Empire managed its vast territories, how it balanced the needs of diverse ethnic groups, and how it maintained control over far-flung provinces. Most importantly, they learned the delicate art of managing long-distance trade, understanding how political stability, military protection, and diplomatic finesse all contributed to commercial success. The Songhai also absorbed Islamic influences. During this period, though they did so selectively and on their own terms, Islam had come to West Africa through trade and scholarly exchange rather than conquest, and it took root most readily in urban centers where merchants and intellectuals appreciated its emphasis on literacy, law, and commercial ethics. In Gao, Islamic practices blended with traditional Songhai beliefs, creating a unique synthesis that would later characterize the empire's approach to religion and governance. As the 14th century progressed, signs of Mali's declining power became increasingly apparent. The empire that had once seemed invincible began to struggle with succession disputes, rebellions in distant provinces, and the emergence of new trade routes that bypassed its traditional centers of control. For the Songhai, watching these developments from their position on the empire's eastern frontier, Mali's difficulties represented both a challenge and an opportunity. They could attempt to maintain their loyalty to a weakening overlord, or they could strike out on their own, betting that their knowledge of trade, their strategic position, and their growing military capabilities would allow them to succeed where Mali was beginning to fail. The decline of the Mali Empire was not a sudden collapse, but rather a gradual weakening that played out over decades, like a great tree slowly losing its leaves to an approaching winter. By the 1430s, the signs of decay were unmistakable to those who knew how to read them. Succession disputes had divided the royal family. Provincial governors had begun acting with increasing independence, and the empire's military, once feared throughout West Africa, had lost much of its discipline and effectiveness. For the Songhai, these developments created both danger and opportunity, forcing them to consider whether their future lay in continued submission or in the pursuit of independence. The breaking point came when Mali's grip on its eastern provinces became so tenuous that local rulers began asserting their autonomy with impunity. The Songhai leadership in Gao, led by members of the Sonni dynasty who had long chafed under Malian rule, recognized that the moment for action had arrived. They began by testing Mali's resolve with small acts of defiance, refusing to send the full amount of tribute, ignoring summons to the imperial court, and providing sanctuary to refugees from other rebellious provinces. When Mali's response proved weak and ineffectual, the Songhai grew bolder. They began expanding their influence beyond Gao itself, reaching out to neighboring communities that had also grown tired of Malian demands. The message they carried was simple but powerful. Join with us, and together we can create something greater than what Mali offers. This was not merely a call for rebellion, but an invitation to participate in a new vision of West African civilization, one that would be built on the foundations of trade, scholarship, and military strength. The early years of Songhai independence were marked by careful consolidation rather than dramatic expansion. The new kingdom's leaders understood that they needed to establish firm control over their immediate territory before they could dream of competing with Mali on a larger stage. They focused on strengthening Gao's defenses, building up their military forces, and establishing diplomatic relationships with other powers in the region. Most importantly, they worked to ensure that the trade routes passing through their territory remained secure and profitable, knowing that economic prosperity would provide the foundation for future military adventures. It was during this period of careful preparation that Sunni Ali began to emerge as a figure of growing importance within the Songhai leadership. Born into the ruling Sunni dynasty sometime in the early 15th century, Ali displayed from an early age the combination of military skill, political cunning, and charismatic leadership that would make him one of West Africa's most formidable rulers. His education encompassed both traditional Songhai customs and Islamic learning, giving him the cultural flexibility to appeal to different constituencies within his diverse realm. Ali's rise to power was neither sudden nor uncontested. The Songhai political system, like those of other West African kingdoms, involved complex negotiations between royal lineages, military commanders, and influential merchants. Succession was not simply a matter of primogeniture, but required a candidate to demonstrate both his legitimacy and his capability to rule effectively. Ali proved himself in both respects, combining his royal bloodline with demonstrated military prowess and a clear vision for Songhai's future. When Ali finally assumed power around 1464, he inherited a kingdom that was prosperous but vulnerable, strategically positioned but surrounded by powerful enemies. To the west, the Mali Empire, despite its decline, still commanded substantial resources and might seek to reassert its authority over its former province. To the south, the Mossi kingdoms posed a constant threat with their cavalry forces and aggressive expansion policies. To the north, Tuareg nomads controlled many of the desert trade routes and had little loyalty to any sedentary ruler. Ali understood that Songhai's survival depended on his ability to address all these challenges while simultaneously building the internal strength necessary for long-term success. The young ruler's approach to these challenges revealed both his strategic intelligence and his understanding of West African political realities. Rather than attempting to fight all his enemies simultaneously, Ali chose to focus on the most immediate threats while working to neutralize others through diplomacy, alliance building, and strategic patience. He recognized that Songhai's greatest asset was its position at the heart of the trans-Saharan trade network. and he was determined to use this advantage to maximum effect. Ali's military philosophy was revolutionary for its time and place. Unlike many African rulers who relied primarily on infantry forces supplemented by cavalry, Ali recognized the unique possibilities offered by Songhai's riverine environment. He began construction of a naval fleet that would give his forces unprecedented mobility along the Niger River and its tributaries. These vessels, larger and more heavily armed than the traditional fishing boats of the Sorko people, could transport troops quickly to threatened areas, supply besieged cities, and project Songhai power far beyond the kingdom's traditional boundaries. The creation of this river fleet represented more than just military innovation. It demonstrated Ali's understanding of how geography could be transformed from a constraint into an advantage. The Niger River, which had always been important for trade and communication, now became a highway for military operations, allowing Songhai forces to move with speed and surprise that their enemies could not match. This naval capability would prove crucial in the campaigns that lay ahead, giving Ali the ability to strike at targets that seemed impossibly distant and to maintain supply lines across vast distances. By 1468, Sunni Ali had completed his preparations and was ready to test Songhai's strength against its neighbors. His first major campaign targeted the city of Timbuktu, that legendary center of learning and commerce that had long been the jewel of Mali's eastern territories. Timbuktu's strategic importance was undeniably sat at the confluence of several major trade routes and served as the intellectual heart of Islamic West Africa. More importantly, for Ali's purposes, it was currently under the control of Tuareg nomads who had seized it from Mali. During that empire's period of weakness, the campaign for Timbuktu revealed Ali's tactical brilliance and his understanding of how to leverage Songhai's unique advantages. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the city's formidable defenses, Ali used his river fleet to establish control over the Niger at key points, effectively cutting off Timbuktu's waterborne supply lines. He then combined this naval blockade with traditional siege tactics, surrounding the city with his land forces while maintaining pressure on multiple fronts. The Tuareg defenders of Timbuktu found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. Ali's forces displayed a level of coordination and strategic sophistication that reflected years of careful preparation and training. More troubling for the defenders was the apparent enthusiasm with which many of Timbuktu's inhabitants welcomed the prospect of Songhai rule. The city's merchants, in particular, saw Ali's conquest as potentially beneficial for trade, while many Islamic scholars viewed the Tuareg as crude nomads whose rule had brought neither stability nor intellectual advancement. When Timbuktu finally fell to Ali's forces, the manner of its conquest sent shockwaves throughout West Africa. Unlike the destructive sieges that had characterized much of the region's warfare, Ali's takeover of the city was remarkably restrained. He offered terms of surrender that protected the lives and property of civilians, guaranteed the safety of merchants and scholars, and promised to maintain Timbuktu's traditional role as a center of learning and commerce. This approach was not merely humanitarian but deeply strategic, designed to demonstrate that Songhai rule offered benefits rather than merely domination. The conquest of Timbuktu marked a turning point in Ali's reign and in the history of West Africa. It demonstrated that the Songhai had become a force capable of challenging the established order and that Ali himself possessed the military skill and political wisdom necessary to build a lasting empire. Perhaps more importantly, the campaign established a template for future Songhai banana combination of military pressure and diplomatic inducement that maximized gains while minimizing destruction. Fresh from his triumph at Timbuktu, Ali turned his attention to another prize that had long tempted Songhai ambitions, the trading city of Jen. Located on an island in the Niger River, Jen was naturally fortified and had a reputation for fierce independence that had allowed it to maintain its autonomy even during Mali's height. The city's merchants had grown wealthy through their control of gold trade from the southern forests, and its scholars had established schools that rivaled those of Timbuktu. In their reputation for learning and scholarship, the siege of Jen would prove to be Ali's greatest military challenge, and his most impressive victory. The city's island location made it impossible to assault directly, while its inhabitants were prepared to endure a long siege rather than submit to foreign rule. Ali responded by demonstrating the patience and strategic thinking that had become his hallmarks. Instead of attempting a costly frontal assault, he settled in for a siege that would ultimately last 7 years. Using his control of the river to prevent supplies from reaching the city, while gradually tightening his grip on the surrounding region. During the long siege of Jen, Ali continued to campaign elsewhere, using the city's resistance as a demonstration of his determination while pursuing other objectives that would strengthen Songhai's position. He led expeditions against the Mossi kingdoms to the south, defeating their cavalry forces in battles that showcased the superiority of Songhai military organization and tactics. These victories not only secured Songhai's southern frontier, but also sent a clear message to other potential enemies about the consequences of challenging Ali's growing empire. The psychological impact of Ali's military successes extended far beyond the immediate military gains. Across West Africa, rulers and merchants began to recalculate their relationships with their neighbors in light of Songhai's emergence as a major power. Some sought alliances with Ali, hoping to benefit from association with his growing empire. Others began their own military preparations, understanding that the regional balance of power had shifted dramatically, and that old assumptions about security and independence could no longer be taken for granted. When Jen finally surrendered in 1473, it was not because its walls had been breached or its defenders overwhelmed, but because the long siege had finally exhausted the city's ability to resist. Ali's acceptance of the city's surrender demonstrated the same political wisdom he had shown at Timbuktu. Rather than punishing Jen for its long resistance, he incorporated the city into his empire on generous terms, allowing its merchants to continue their traditional trade and its scholars to maintain their schools and libraries. The fall of Jen marked the completion of Ali's transformation of Songhai from a regional kingdom into a true empire, with control over both Timbuktu and Jen. The Songhai now dominated the central portion of the Niger River and commanded the trade routes that connected the Sahara with the forests of the south. More importantly, Ali had demonstrated that his empire was built not merely on military conquest, but on a vision of prosperity and stability that could attract voluntary adherence as well as compel submission. The years following the conquest of Jen saw Ali at the height of his powers, commanding an empire that stretched along the Niger River from the Great Bend at Timbuktu to the markets of Gao and beyond. His domain encompassed not just territory, but a complex network of trade routes, cultural exchanges, and political relationships that made Songhai the most powerful state in West Africa. Yet Ali understood that conquest was only the beginning of empire building. The real challenge lay in creating institutions and systems that could maintain unity and prosperity across such a vast and diverse realm. Ali's approach to governance reflected His deep understanding of West African political traditions combined with pragmatic adaptations to the unique challenges faced by his empire. Rather than attempting to impose a uniform system of administration across all his territories, he developed a flexible approach that allowed different regions to maintain many of their traditional practices while ensuring their loyalty to the central government. This system required careful balancing of local autonomy with imperial authority, a task that demanded both political skill and cultural sensitivity. The emperor's military innovations continued to evolve throughout this period, reflecting both the lessons learned from his campaigns and the changing nature of the challenges he faced. The river fleet that had proved so crucial in his early conquests was expanded and professionalized, with specialized vessels designed for different types of operations. Some ships were configured as troop transports, capable of quickly moving large numbers of soldiers to threatened areas. Others served as floating supply depots, ensuring that distant campaigns could be sustained over extended periods. Still others were designed as command vessels, allowing Ali and his generals to maintain communications and coordinate operations across the vast distances of their empire. The success of Ali's naval innovations inspired similar developments in his land forces. The traditional cavalry units that formed the backbone of most West African armies were supplemented by specialized infantry formations trained for specific tasks. Some units specialized in siege warfare, equipped with the tools and knowledge necessary to reduce fortified cities. Others were trained as rapid response forces, capable of quick deployment to meet unexpected threats. Perhaps most importantly, Ali created a professional officer corps whose members were selected for their ability rather than their birth, ensuring that the empire's military would be led by competent commanders regardless of their social origins. The economic foundations of Ali's empire were as impressive as its military achievements. The conquest of Timbuktu and Jen had given Songhai control over the most important commercial centers in the region. But Ali understood that maintaining this economic dominance required more than simply collecting taxes from passing merchants. He implemented policies designed to encourage trade, including standardized weights and measures, guaranteed safe passage for caravans, and the establishment of commercial courts that could quickly resolve disputes between traders from different cultures and legal traditions. Perhaps most significantly, Ali recognized that the empire's long-term prosperity depended on maintaining good relationships with the various groups that made trans-Saharan trade possible. This included not only the merchants who organized and financed long-distance commerce, but also the nomadic guides who knew the desert routes, the oasis dwellers who provided crucial services to passing caravans, and the craft specialists who produced the goods that made trade profitable. By treating these groups as partners rather than subjects, Ali ensured that Songhai's commercial networks would continue to function smoothly even during periods of political or military tension. The cultural dimensions of Ali's empire were as complex as its political and economic aspects. The territories under Songhai control encompassed numerous ethnic groups, each with its own language, customs, and traditions. Ali's approach to this diversity was pragmatic rather than ideological. He sought to maintain stability and loyalty rather than to impose cultural uniformity. This meant that local customs were generally respected as long as they did not conflict with imperial policies, while the Songhai language and Islamic legal traditions gradually spread through their practical advantages rather than through coercion. The relationship between traditional African religious practices and Islam presented particular challenges for Ali's administration. As a ruler who needed to maintain the loyalty of both Muslim merchants and scholars and traditional communities that maintained ancestral religious practices, Ali developed a flexible approach that avoided forcing difficult choices upon his subjects. Islamic law was applied in commercial matters and in areas where it provided clear administrative advantages, while traditional practices continued in local communities where they maintained social cohesion and cultural identity. Ali's personal religious practices reflected this same pragmatic approach. He observed Islamic rituals when political necessity demanded it, particularly when dealing with Muslim merchants or foreign dignitaries who expected such displays of piety. At the same time, he maintained connections to traditional Songhai religious practices, understanding that many of his subjects viewed these traditions as essential elements of their cultural identity. This religious flexibility, while criticized by some Islamic scholars, proved essential to maintaining unity within the diverse Songhai Empire. As the 1480s progressed, Ali's empire faced new challenges that tested both his military capabilities and his diplomatic skills. The Mossi kingdoms to the south, recovering from their earlier defeats, began organizing a coordinated response to Songhai expansion. The Tuareg nomads, displaced from Timbuktu but still controlling many desert routes, sought opportunities to reclaim their lost territories. Most ominously, reports began reaching Gao of Portuguese activities along the Atlantic coast, where European traders were establishing direct relationships with gold-producing regions that had traditionally been accessed only through trans-Saharan routes. Ali's response to these emerging threats demonstrated the strategic thinking that had characterized his entire reign. Rather than attempting to address all challenges simultaneously, he prioritized threats based on their immediacy and potential impact on Songhai's core interests. The Mossi challenge was met with decisive military action as Ali led a series of campaigns that not only defeated the southern kingdoms but also extended Songhai influence further into the gold-producing regions. The Tuareg problem was addressed through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic incentives, offering the nomads opportunities to profit from trade under Songhai protection rather than continuing their costly resistance. The Portuguese challenge proved more complex, as it represented a fundamental shift in the global economic system rather than a traditional military threat. Ali recognized that European access to West African gold markets could potentially undermine the trans-Saharan trade that formed the foundation of Songhai prosperity. However, he also understood that this threat was not immediate and that premature action might create more problems than it solved. Instead, he focused on strengthening Songhai's position within the existing trade network while carefully monitoring European activities and their potential impact on his empire's interests. By the end of the 1480s, Sunni Ali had transformed the Songhai from a small kingdom centered on Gao into the dominant power in West Africa. His empire controlled the most important trade routes in the region, commanded military forces that had proven their effectiveness against all comers, and had developed administrative systems capable of governing diverse populations across vast distances. Most importantly, Ali had created an empire that was not merely a collection of conquered territories, but a coherent political and economic system that offered its subjects prosperity, security, and opportunities for advancement, regardless of their ethnic or religious backgrounds. Yet even as Ali celebrated his achievements, he remained aware that empires, like rivers, must continue to flow or risk becoming stagnant. The world around Songhai was changing in ways that would require new strategies and new approaches. The Portuguese presence on the coast was growing stronger. Traditional trading patterns were beginning to shift, and new generations of leaders in neighboring kingdoms were preparing challenges that would test Songhai's continued dominance. As Oli entered the final years of his reign, he understood that his greatest challenge would be ensuring that the empire he had built could adapt and evolve to meet whatever changes the future might bring. The Niger River continued its ancient course, carrying the hopes and dreams of countless peoples toward distant seas. Along its banks, the cities and towns of the Songhai Empire bustled with activity, their markets filled with goods from across Africa and beyond. In Gao, the capital that had grown from a simple trading post into the heart of a mighty empire, scholars debated questions of law and philosophy, while merchants calculated profits from caravans that would carry their goods across the vastness of the Sahara. And throughout this realm, people who had once lived in isolation from one another now participated in a common enterprise that spanned continents and connected civilizations that had never before known of each other's existence. The year was 1470, and along the Niger River's gentle curves, the sound of war drums echoed across waters that had known peace for generations. Sonni Ali's forces had grown beyond a mere army. They had become a force of nature, sweeping across the landscape like the annual floods that renewed the earth. His cavalry moved with the precision of migrating birds, each rider knowing his place in the greater pattern of conquest that was reshaping West Africa. From Timbuktu, now firmly under Songhai control, reports flowed like tributaries into the great river of intelligence that fed Sonni Ali's strategic mind. The Tuareg, those nomadic warriors who had ruled the city since 1433, had been scattered like sand before the wind. Their blue-veiled faces, once symbols of untouchable authority in the desert city, now looked back from distant camps with the hollow gaze of the dispossessed. The great libraries of Timbuktu, repositories of Islamic learning that attracted scholars from Cairo to Cordoba, opened their doors once again to the free flow of knowledge. Yet, Sonni Ali's vision stretched beyond Timbuktu's mud-brick walls and gleaming minarets. To the southwest, like a jewel set in the Niger's embrace, lay Gen, that ancient city whose very name whispered of wealth and wisdom. Gen had prospered for centuries as a crucial link in the trans-Saharan trade, its markets alive with the voices of merchants speaking Arabic, Fulani, Monde, and a dozen other tongues. Gold dust changed hands for bars of precious salt, while ivory tusks were weighed against bolts of fine cloth from the Mediterranean world. The people of Gen, confident in their city's natural defenses and accumulated wealth, believed themselves beyond the reach of any conqueror. Their city rose from an island in the Niger Delta during the dry season. But when the rains came and the waters swelled, Gen became truly island-bound, accessible only by the most skilled river pilots who knew the shifting channels and hidden sandbars. Their walls were high, their granaries full, and their faith in their impregnability absolute. But Sonni Ali understood something that Gen's defenders did not. Time was a weapon more powerful than any sword or spear. In 1473, as the dry season settled over the land and the Niger retreated to its lowest channels, Songhai forces surrounded the city like a great serpent coiling around its prey. This would not be a battle of thunderous charges and glorious single combats. This would be a siege of patience, a slow strangulation that would test the resolve of both besieged and besieger. The siege of Gen became the stuff of legend, not for its dramatic battles, but for its relentless persistence. 7 years passed like the slow turn of seasons, each one bringing renewed hope to the defenders that this would be the year their tormentors would tire and withdraw. 7 harvests came and went while Songhai forces maintained their watch, their camps becoming permanent settlements, their soldiers raising families in the shadow of Gen's walls. Within the city, life gradually transformed from abundance to austerity, from confidence to quiet desperation. The great markets that had once bustled with international commerce grew silent as trade routes shifted to avoid the besieged city. Children who had been born after the siege knew no world beyond the city's walls, their games echoing in empty bazaars where once camels had been loaded with gold and salt. Sonni Ali himself did not remain idle during these 7 years. His empire building continued apace as he recognized that conquest was only the beginning of true dominion. The administrative structure he established would become a model that his successors would refine and expand. Unlike the loose confederation that had characterized the declining Mali Empire, Sonni Ali envisioned a centralized state where authority flowed from the capital at Gao, like the Niger's waters flowing to the sea. He divided his expanding territories into provinces, each governed by an appointed administrator who answered directly to the king. These governors were chosen not from traditional local nobility, but from among those who had proven their loyalty to the new order. Many were drawn from the ranks of successful military commanders, men who understood both the necessity of discipline and the rewards of faithful service. Others came from the merchant classes, individuals whose practical experience in trade and diplomacy made them natural administrators of the empire's growing commercial interests. The collection of tribute became systematized under Sonni Ali's rule rather than the irregular raids that had characterized earlier periods. A steady flow of wealth now moved toward Gao from every corner of the empire. Gold from the southern mines, salt from Saharan deposits, cattle from pastoral peoples, grain from agricultural communities, all contributed to the imperial treasury that financed the military expeditions and administrative apparatus that kept the empire functioning. Yet Sonni Ali understood that lasting rule required more than military might and efficient taxation. The construction of irrigation works during his reign revealed a ruler who thought beyond immediate conquest to the long-term prosperity of his people. Dikes were built to control the Niger's seasonal flooding, channeling the life-giving waters to previously barren lands. These engineering projects required the coordination of thousands of workers and represented investments in the future that would pay dividends for generations. The agricultural improvements that resulted from these irrigation works helped support the growing urban populations of the empire's major cities. As trade flourished under the security that Songhai rule provided, Timbuktu, Gao, and eventually Gen would see their populations swell with merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and administrators drawn by economic opportunity and political stability. Meanwhile, the siege of Gen continued its slow work. By the 6th year, the defenders' situation had become desperate. The granaries that had once seemed inexhaustible were nearly empty. The city's wells, adequate for normal times, could no longer meet the needs of a population swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside. Disease began to take its toll as malnutrition weakened immune systems and overcrowding created perfect conditions for epidemics. The breaking point came not with a dramatic assault, but with the quiet realization that further resistance meant only unnecessary suffering. In 1480, 7 years after the siege had begun, Gen's gates opened at last. The city's leaders, hollow-eyed but dignified, emerged to offer their submission to Sonni Ali, the great conqueror, now graying at the temples but still commanding in presence, received their surrender with the magnanimity of a ruler confident in his power. The fall of Gen marked a watershed moment in the history of West Africa. With Timbuktu and Jen under Songhai control, the empire now commanded the two most important commercial centers along the Middle Niger. Trade routes that had operated for centuries were now unified under a single authority, creating opportunities for economic growth and integration that had never before existed. But even as he celebrated the conquest of Jen, Sonni Ali faced new challenges that would test his leadership in different ways. The Mossi kingdoms to the south, traditional enemies of all Sudanic empires, launched raids against Songhai territories. These attacks were not coordinated attempts at conquest, but rather the traditional raids that had been a feature of Mossi culture for generations, swift strikes designed to capture slaves and livestock, before melting back into their homelands, forests, and hills. Sonni Ali's response to these Mossi incursions revealed another aspect of his military genius. Rather than attempting to conquer the Mossi homeland, a difficult proposition, given its terrain and the fierce resistance of its people, he focused on defensive measures that would make such raids unprofitable. Fortified settlements were established. Along the southern frontier, their garrisons composed of soldiers whose families lived within the protected walls. This created a permanent military presence that could respond quickly to any threats, while also serving as bases for retaliatory strikes when necessary. The emperor's treatment of religion during this period reflected the complex balancing act required to rule a diverse empire. Sonni Ali himself maintained traditional Songhai religious practices, consulting with indigenous priests and participating in ceremonies that connected him to the ancestral spirits of his people. Yet he also recognized the importance of Islam in the urban commercial centers that were the economic heart of his empire. This religious pragmatism sometimes put him at odds with Muslim scholars and leaders, particularly those in Timbuktu, who viewed his traditional practices as incompatible with Islamic faith. Some chronicles, written by Islamic historians, would later characterize Sonni Ali as a persecutor of Muslims, but the evidence suggests a more nuanced reality. While he was certainly intolerant of those who used religious authority to challenge his political power, he generally allowed Islamic practice to continue in the cities where it was well-established. The tension between traditional and Islamic practices would become one of the defining characteristics of the Songhai Empire, influencing political developments long after Sonni Ali's death. This cultural and religious complexity reflected the broader challenge of governing an empire that included desert nomads and river-dwelling farmers, animist traditionalists and Islamic scholars, established urban merchants and newly conquered peoples who had never before been part of any large political structure. As the 1480s progressed, Sonni Ali's empire reached a territorial extent that dwarfed its predecessors. From the Atlantic coast in the west to the bend of the Niger in the east, from the edge of the Sahara in the north to the forest margins in the south, Songhai authority extended over a vast and diverse landscape. The logistics of governing such an empire was staggering, requiring a communication system that could relay orders and information across distances that took weeks to traverse. The Niger River served as the empire's primary highway, its waters, carrying not only trade goods, but also messengers, administrators, and military forces. Sonni Ali's investment in a river fleet, the first naval force in the region's history, proved crucial to maintaining imperial unity. These vessels, constructed from the sturdy wood of the region's largest trees, could carry substantial loads of men and supplies while navigating the seasonal variations in the river's depth and current. The emperor's court at Gao became a center of power that attracted ambitious individuals from across West Africa and beyond. Here, in the growing capital city, the future of the empire was debated and decided. Traditional Songhai nobles shared influence with Islamic scholars, successful merchants, and military commanders who had proven their worth in the recent campaigns. This mixing of different backgrounds and perspectives created a dynamic political environment, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflicts. Sonni, Ali's success in expanding and consolidating the empire created new problems that would challenge his successors. The question of succession, always crucial in monarchical systems, became particularly complex in a state that encompassed such diverse populations and interests. Traditional Songhai succession practices had developed when the kingdom was much smaller and more homogeneous. Now, with an empire stretching across much of West Africa, the stakes of succession disputes were enormously higher. The emperor's own sons were raised in this atmosphere of imperial grandeur and political complexity. Unlike their father, who had risen to power through military prowess and political acumen during a time of crisis, they knew only the comfort and security of established power. This generational difference would prove significant when the time came for the transfer of authority, as the 1490s began. Sonni Ali was entering the final phase of his remarkable reign. Now in his 60s, he had transformed a small kingdom centered on Gao into the largest empire in West African history. His military campaigns had secured the empire's borders and established Songhai as the dominant power in the region. His administrative innovations had created governmental structures that could function across vast distances and diverse populations. His economic policies had fostered trade and agriculture, creating prosperity that attracted people from throughout the known world. Yet beneath the surface of imperial success, tensions were building that would soon reshape the political landscape. The question of religious identity, temporarily managed through Sonni Ali's pragmatic approach, remained unresolved. The challenge of imperial succession, always present in monarchical systems, was complicated by the empire's size and diversity. Most importantly, the very success of Sonni Ali's conquests had created a new generation of military leaders and administrators, whose ambitions and loyalties would be tested when the great emperor was no longer there to command their obedience. The year 1492 dawned over the Songhai Empire with deceptive tranquility. The Niger's seasonal flood had been generous, filling the irrigation channels that Sonni Ali's engineers had carved into the landscape and promising abundant harvests in the months to come. In Timbuktu, the morning call to prayer echoed across a city that had grown prosperous under imperial protection, while in Gao, the imperial court prepared for another day of governing an empire that now stretched farther than any single man could travel in a lifetime. But beneath this surface, calm currents of change were stirring that would soon reshape the political landscape of West Africa. Sonni Ali, now approaching 70, had ruled for 28 years with an iron hand wrapped in diplomatic velvet. His empire was stable, prosperous, and secure, perhaps too secure, for in that security lay the seeds of the crisis that would soon unfold. The emperor's health, long, robust, despite the rigors of constant campaigning, had begun to show signs of decline. Those close to him noticed the subtle changes, a certain deliberateness in his movements that had once been swift and decisive, moments of fatigue during long council sessions that once energized him, and most tellingly, an increasing reliance on his most trusted advisors for matters he had previously handled personally. Yet Sonni Ali's mind remained sharp, and his political instincts as keen as ever. He understood that the question of succession, long deferred through the simple expedient of his continued good health, could no longer be ignored. His eldest son, Sonni Baru, had been groomed for power from an early age, trained in the arts of war and governance that had made his father successful. But Baru's approach to the complex religious and cultural dynamics of the empire differed markedly from his father's pragmatic balance between tradition and Islam, where Sonni Ali had carefully navigated between the competing claims of different religious communities. Baru aligned himself more closely with traditional Songhai practices and the known Islamic populations of the empire. This stance won him support among some groups, particularly the pastoral peoples of the empire's periphery, who had always viewed the growing Islamic influence in urban centers with suspicion. But it also created anxiety among the Muslim merchants and scholars whose economic and intellectual contributions were crucial to the empire's continued prosperity. The tension surrounding religious identity had been manageable under Sonni Ali's strong leadership, but the prospect of succession brought these underlying conflicts to the surface. In the mosques of Timbuktu and the trading houses of Jen, conversations increasingly turned to questions about the future direction of the empire. Would the new ruler continue his father's policy of religious tolerance, or would the empire's traditional practices reassert themselves at the expense of Islamic influence? Among those most concerned about these developments was Muhammad Touré, one of Sonni Ali's most successful generals and a man whose own trajectory embodied the complexity of the empire's cultural evolution. Born into a family with both Sonni and Sunnic heritage, Muhammad had risen through the imperial hierarchy based on military skill and administrative competence. His conversion to Islam had been sincere rather than merely political, and he had made the pilgrimage to Mecca an expensive and dangerous journey that demonstrated both his commitment to the faith and his access to considerable resources. Muhammad Touré's position within the imperial administration gave him intimate knowledge of the empire's strengths and vulnerabilities. He understood better than most how much the Songhai state depended on the continued cooperation of diverse religious and ethnic communities. The wealth that flowed through Timbuktu and Jen came largely from Muslim merchants who had established trading relationships across the Islamic world. The administrative efficiency that allowed the empire to function despite its vast size relied heavily on Islamic legal traditions and scholarly networks. As Sonni Ali's health continued to decline through the early months of 1492, the question of succession became more urgent. The emperor had not formally designated an heir, following the traditional Songhai practice of allowing succession to be determined through a combination of royal blood, popular support, and political maneuvering. This system had worked well enough when the kingdom was smaller and more cohesive, but in an empire of Songhai's current size and complexity, the potential for succession disputes to tear the state apart was enormous. The crisis came suddenly, as such crises often do. In November 1492, while returning from a campaign against raiders who had been harassing the empire's southern borders, Sonni Ali fell ill. Some accounts suggest he drowned while crossing a river, others that he succumbed to fever, and still others that he was struck down by enemies who had somehow penetrated his personal guard. The exact circumstances of his death would be debated by historians for generations, but the immediate consequence was clear. The Songhai Empire was suddenly without the leader who had shaped its destiny for nearly 3 decades. News of the emperor's death spread across the empire with the speed of wildfire, carried by the same communication networks that had allowed Sonni Ali to govern such a vast territory. In every major city and provincial center, the question was the same: who would now claim the throne of the most powerful empire in West Africa? The answer would determine not only the political future of the Songhai state, but the religious and cultural direction of the entire region. Sonni Baru moved quickly to assert his claim to the throne. As the eldest son of the deceased emperor and the heir who had been groomed for power, he had strong arguments in his favor. Traditional law supported his succession, and he had the backing of important segments of the military and civilian leadership. In the immediate aftermath of his father's death, it appeared that the transition would proceed smoothly, with minimal disruption to the empire's stability. But appearances could be deceiving, particularly in a political system as complex as that of the Songhai Empire. Even as Sonni Baru consolidated his position in Gao and received the formal submission of many provincial governors, opposition was coalescing around Muhammad Turi. The general's supporters argued that Baru's traditionalist stance threatened the religious and cultural balance that had made the empire prosperous, and they pointed to Muhammad's military record and administrative competence as evidence of his fitness to rule. The conflict that emerged was not simply a personal rivalry between two ambitious men, though personal ambition certainly played a role. Instead, it reflected deeper tensions within Songhai society about the empire's identity and future direction. Would the Songhai Empire remain primarily a traditional African state that happened to include significant Muslim populations? Or would it evolve into an Islamic empire that drew its legitimacy and administrative practices from the broader Muslim world? The military forces of the empire found themselves divided along lines that reflected these broader cultural and religious tensions. Units drawn from traditional Songhai heartlands tended to support Sonni Baru, while those recruited from more cosmopolitan urban centers or from populations with strong Islamic connections were more likely to favor Muhammad Turi. The Imperial fleet, so crucial to maintaining control over the Niger River and the cities along its banks, became a particular focus of competition between the rival claimants. S 1493 dawned. The Songhai Empire faced its greatest internal crisis since Sonni Ali's rise to power 3 decades earlier. The question was no longer simply who would rule, but what kind of state the empire would become. The resolution of this crisis would shape not only the immediate political landscape, but the long-term development of West African civilization. Muhammad Tour's strategy during this critical period revealed the political sophistication that would characterize his later reign. Rather than immediately challenging Sonni Baru militarily, he focused on building a coalition that could provide both the legitimacy and the practical power necessary to claim the throne. This meant reaching out to groups that had benefited from the empire's expansion and prosperity: urban merchants, Islamic scholars, successful administrators, and military commanders who had risen through merit rather than birth. The general also demonstrated his understanding of the symbolic dimensions of political power. His public embrace of Islamic practices and his emphasis on the pilgrimage he had completed to Mecca served to contrast his cosmopolitan credentials with Sonni Baru's more parochial traditionalism. In an empire where trade connections to the broader Islamic world were crucial to economic prosperity, this distinction carried practical as well as symbolic weight. The decisive confrontation came in late 1493, less than a year after Sonni Ali's death. The details of the conflict that brought Muhammad Turi to power are obscured by the partisan nature of the sources that recorded them. But the outcome was clear. Sonni Baru was deposed and killed, and Muhammad Turi claimed the throne of the Songhai Empire. To mark his victory and his intention to rule differently than his predecessors, the new emperor adopted the title Askia, meaning usurper in the Songhai language, a term he transformed from an accusation into a badge of honor. The ascension of Askia Muhammad, as he would be known to history, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of West African Empire. The pragmatic balance between traditional and Islamic practices that had characterized Sunni Ali's reign would give way to a more explicitly Islamic orientation, with consequences that would reshape not only the Songhai Empire, but the entire cultural landscape of the Western Sudan. The great transformation was beginning, and with it, the empire would reach heights of power and influence that even Sunni Ali might not have imagined possible. In the hushed corridors of Gao's palace, where the morning light filtered through, carved wooden screens and cast dancing shadows upon stone floors, Mohammed Touré found himself transformed from military commander to emperor. The year was 1493, and the weight of an empire now rested upon shoulders that had once carried only the burden of a soldier's spear. The man who would become known to history as Askia Muhammad stood at the threshold of what would become Songhai's most luminous age, though he could not yet see the golden threads that fate was weaving around his destiny. The transition from the reign of Sunni Ali to that of Mohammed Touré marked more than a change of rulers. It represented a fundamental shift in the empire's soul. Where Sunni Ali had been the warrior king, fierce and untamed as the desert winds, Mohammed Touré would become the architect of civilization, patient and methodical as the Niger's eternal flow. His first acts as emperor revealed the careful mind of a man who understood that empires are built not merely through conquest, but through the delicate art of governance that transforms disparate peoples into a unified whole. The new emperor's initial challenge was left to heal the wounds left by the civil war that had brought him to power. Sonni Baru's brief reign had divided the nobility, creating factions that threatened to tear the empire apart even as external enemies pressed against its borders. Mohammed Touré approached this task with the wisdom of a man who had spent years observing the delicate balance required to hold together a realm of such vast diversity. He understood that force alone could not mend what had been broken. Only justice, generosity, and the promise of shared prosperity could restore unity to his fractured domain. In those early months of his reign, the emperor traveled extensively throughout his territories, not as a conqueror asserting dominance, but as a leader seeking to understand the needs and aspirations of his people. He visited the fishing villages along the Niger's banks, where the Sorko people had for generations cast their nets into waters that reflected the endless sky. He journeyed to the agricultural settlements where the Dew farmers tended their fields, with the same patient devotion their ancestors had shown for centuries. He met with the merchants in the bustling markets of Timbuktu and Jen, listening to their concerns about trade routes and taxation with the tension of a ruler who recognized that commerce was the lifeblood of his empire. What emerged from these journeys was a deeper understanding of the complex tapestry that was the Songhai Empire. Unlike the earlier kingdoms of Ghana and Mali, which had been built around single dominant ethnic groups, Songhai was a magnificent mosaic of peoples. The Songhai themselves, the Mand traders, the Fulani herders, the Tuareg nomads, the Hausa craftsmen, and dozens of smaller groups, each contributing their unique gifts to the empire's collective strength. Mohammed Touré recognized that the empire's future lay not in imposing uniformity upon this diversity, but in creating a system of governance that could honor and harness the distinctive talents of each group, while binding them together in common cause. In the 4th year of his reign, as the empire had begun to stabilize under his careful guidance, Mohammed Touré made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He announced his intention to undertake the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca that represented one of the fundamental obligations of the Islamic faith. This was no mere religious gesture, though faith certainly motivated the emperor's decision. The pilgrimage would serve multiple purposes. It would demonstrate Songhai's prosperity and importance to the wider Islamic world, establish diplomatic relations with other Muslim rulers, and perhaps most importantly, provide the emperor with the spiritual and intellectual foundation he would need to guide his empire into a new age of Islamic scholarship and culture. The preparations for the imperial pilgrimage were elaborate beyond anything previously seen in West Africa. The emperor assembled a caravan that would have impressed the sultans of Cairo or Baghdad, 500 cavalry, resplendent in their ceremonial armor, formed the emperor's guard. 1,000 infantry marched alongside, their spears gleaming in the desert sun. But most remarkable of all was the wealth that the emperor carried with him: 300,000 pieces of gold, a fortune so vast that it would make the pilgrimage legendary throughout the Islamic world. The journey itself was an epic that unfolded across months and thousands of miles. The imperial caravan followed the ancient trans-Saharan routes that had carried countless pilgrims and merchants before them. But never had these paths borne such magnificent testimony to Africa's wealth and power. As they traversed the endless dunes of the Sahara, where the very silence seemed to whisper of eternity, the emperor spent long hours in contemplation, preparing himself for the transformation that he sensed awaited him in the holy cities. When the caravan finally reached Mecca, the effect was electric. The assembled pilgrims from across the Islamic world gazed in wonder at this African emperor and his magnificent retinue. The gold that Muhammad Tori distributed as charity was so abundant that it reportedly affected the metal's value in Egyptian markets for years afterward. But more significant than the material display was the respect and recognition that the emperor earned from Islamic scholars and dignitaries. He was honored with the title of Caliph of the Western Sudan, a recognition of his authority not merely as a temporal ruler, but as a guardian of the faith in his distant realm. The intellectual encounters of the pilgrimage proved as transformative as the spiritual ones. In Mecca and Medina, the emperor met with scholars from across the Islamic world, engaging in discussions that broadened his understanding of Islamic law, administration, and culture. He recruited learned men to return with him to Songhai, beginning the process that would transform his empire into one of the great centers of Islamic learning. The emperor also established diplomatic relationships that would prove invaluable in the years to come, creating networks of communication and trade that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the shores of the Red Sea. The emperor who returned from Mecca was subtly but profoundly changed. The man who had departed as Muhammad Tori came back as Askia Muhammad. The title Askia marking his transformation from warrior usurper to legitimate sovereign recognized throughout the Islamic world. But the change was deeper than titles or recognition. It was reflected in his vision for what Songhai could become. Where once he had focused primarily on consolidating power and expanding territory, he now turned his attention to the more complex task of creating institutions that could endure long after his own reign had ended. The emperor's first priority was the establishment of a comprehensive legal system based on Islamic law. This represented a delicate challenge, for while he was committed to implementing Sharia throughout his empire, he also recognized the need to accommodate the diverse legal traditions of his various peoples. The solution he devised was characteristically sophisticated in matters affecting the broader community and intergroup relations. Islamic law would prevail, administered by appointed Qadis judges who had been trained in Islamic jurisprudence. However, in matters of local custom and tradition that did not conflict with Islamic principles, local authorities would retain jurisdiction according to their ancestral practices. To implement this system effectively, the emperor established courts in all major cities and towns throughout the empire. These were not merely judicial institutions, but centers of learning where Islamic law was taught and discussed. The qadis who presided over these courts were selected not only for their knowledge of law, but for their wisdom and ability to navigate the complex cultural landscape of the empire. Many were drawn from the growing class of Islamic scholars that the emperor was cultivating, men who understood both the universal principles of their faith and the particular needs of their African context. The emperor's administrative reforms extended far beyond the legal system. Recognizing that effective governance required more than good intentions, he created a sophisticated bureaucracy that could manage the complex affairs of his vast empire. The imperial government was organized into departments, each headed by a minister with specific responsibilities. The Baloma served as Minister of Defense, responsible not only for military affairs, but for the security of trade, routes, and the maintenance of the empire's extensive communications network. The Haikoi commanded the imperial navy, that fleet of vessels that controlled the Niger River and ensured the safe passage of goods and people along the empire's most vital commercial artery. The Farimonzo oversaw agriculture, a position of crucial importance in an empire where the majority of the population still lived by farming and herding. This ministry was responsible for maintaining the irrigation systems that Sonni Ali had constructed, expanding agricultural productivity through improved techniques, and ensuring food security throughout the empire. The Kalisa farmer served as finance minister, overseeing the collection of taxes, the management of the imperial treasury, and the regulation of trade that generated much of the empire's wealth. Perhaps most innovative was the creation of specialized ministries to handle the empire's diverse population. The Kori farmer was designated as the minister responsible for white foreigners, the Arab and Berber merchants and scholars who played such important roles in the empire's commercial and intellectual life. This position reflected the emperor's recognition that successful governance required understanding and accommodating the needs of all constituents, not merely the indigenous population. Under Askia, Muhammad's patronage, Timbuktu experienced a transformation that elevated it from a prosperous trading city to one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The emperor understood that sustainable power required more than military might or commercial success. It demanded the cultivation of knowledge and learning that could attract scholars and students from across the known world. His investment in Timbuktu's educational institutions represented one of the most far-sighted policies of his remarkable reign. The Sanka Mosque, which had served as a place of worship and basic religious instruction since the city's early days, was expanded and transformed into a university that would rival the great institutions of Cairo, Baghdad, and Cordoba. The emperor provided generous funding for the construction of new facilities, the acquisition of manuscripts, and most importantly, the recruitment of distinguished scholars from across the Islamic world. The professors who came to teach at Sanka brought with them not only their knowledge, but extensive personal libraries that formed the foundation of what would become one of the world's great manuscript collections. The curriculum at Sanka was comprehensive, reflecting the emperor's belief that true learning required mastery of multiple disciplines. Students studied the Quran and Islamic theology, of course, but they also delved into philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, and literature. The university's approach to scholarship was notably open and tolerant, encouraging debate and discussion even on controversial topics. This intellectual freedom attracted students from as far away as North Africa and the Middle East, creating a truly international academic community in the heart of West Africa. The scholars of Timbuktu were not content merely to preserve and transmit existing knowledge. They also made original contributions to their fields. The astronomical observations conducted in Timbuktu were remarkably accurate, contributing to a better understanding of celestial mechanics and helping to improve navigation techniques that benefited merchants and travelers throughout the region. Medical practitioners developed treatments that combined traditional African healing practices with Islamic medical knowledge, creating hybrid approaches that proved particularly effective in treating tropical diseases. The historical works produced in Timbuktu during Askia, Muhammad's reign, provided the first comprehensive written accounts of West African history. These chronicles, written in Arabic but reflecting distinctly African perspectives, preserved for posterity the stories of empires and peoples that might otherwise have been lost to time. The Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Fatash, compiled during this period, remain among our most important sources for understanding the history of medieval West Africa. The emperor's support for learning was not limited to formal institutions. He established a system of scholarships that allowed promising students from throughout the empire to pursue their studies without financial hardship. He created positions for scholars within the imperial administration, recognizing that good governance benefited from the application of learning and wisdom. He also supported the copying and distribution of manuscripts, understanding that knowledge could only fulfill its potential when it was widely accessible. While Askia, Muhammad's commitment to Islamic learning and governance won him acclaim among scholars and religious leaders, his success as an emperor ultimately rested on his ability to maintain and expand the commercial networks that generated the empire's wealth. The emperor approached trade with the same systematic thinking that he applied to administration and education, recognizing that sustainable prosperity required more than simply controlling existing routes. It demanded active cultivation of new opportunities and careful regulation of commercial practices. One of the emperor's most significant innovations was the establishment of standardized weights and measures throughout the empire. Before his reign, different regions and cities had used their own systems, creating confusion and opportunities for fraud that hindered trade. The new imperial standards not only facilitated commerce, but also demonstrated the emperor's authority and the unity of his realm. Merchants could now travel from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Houseland, confident that they understood the terms of trade wherever they went. The emperor also created a comprehensive system of commercial regulation that protected both merchants and consumers while generating revenue for the imperial treasury. Trade inspectors were appointed in all major commercial centers, responsible for ensuring that transactions were conducted fairly and that imperial taxes were properly collected. These officials were carefully selected for their honesty and commercial knowledge, and they were paid well enough to resist the temptation of corruption that might undermine the system's effectiveness. The security of trade routes received particular attention under Askia Muhammad's administration. The emperor recognized that merchants would only venture into distant markets if they could be confident of safe passage, and he accordingly invested heavily in the military infrastructure necessary to protect commercial traffic. Guard posts were established at regular intervals along major routes, and patrol units regularly swept the countryside to deter bandits and raiders. The emperor also negotiated agreements with nomadic groups, offering them compensation for protecting, rather than preying upon merchant caravans. The Niger River, that great commercial highway that connected the empire's heartland with both the Atlantic coast and the interior, received special attention. The imperial navy was expanded and professionalized, with skilled sailors and well-maintained vessels ensuring that river traffic could move safely and efficiently. Harbor facilities were improved in major river ports, and navigation aids were installed to help captains navigate the river's seasonal variations in depth and current. Under the emperor's guidance, Songhai's trade networks expanded far beyond their traditional boundaries. Diplomatic missions were sent to North African rulers, establishing formal trading relationships that gave Songhai merchants access to Mediterranean markets. Similar outreach efforts were made to the forest kingdoms of the south, where gold mines and kola nut groves promised new sources of wealth. The emperor even maintained correspondence with Portuguese traders who had established posts along the Atlantic coast, exploring possibilities for direct maritime trade that might bypass the traditional trans-Saharan routes. The diversity of goods flowing through Songhai markets during this period was remarkable. From the north came salt from the mines of Tagaza, horses from North Africa, and manufactured goods from the Mediterranean world. From the south flowed gold from the mines of Bambouk and Bure, kola nuts prized throughout the Islamic world for their stimulating properties, and ivory from the elephant herds that still roamed the West African forests. Local products included the high-quality textiles produced by Songhai weavers, leather goods renowned for their craftsmanship, and agricultural products from the fertile lands along the Niger. Perhaps Askia, Muhammad's greatest achievement as an emperor, was his success in creating a system of governance that respected and incorporated the empire's remarkable cultural diversity. Unlike rulers who sought to impose uniformity upon their subjects, the emperor recognized that Songhai's strength lay precisely in the different talents and traditions that its various peoples brought to the imperial project. His approach to managing this diversity became a model of tolerant and effective governance that historians would study for centuries afterward. The emperor's religious policy exemplified this inclusive approach. While he was personally devout and actively promoted Islamic learning and practice, he did not attempt to force conversion upon his non-Muslim subjects. Instead, he created a system that allowed different religious communities to coexist peacefully, while encouraging voluntary adoption of Islamic practices through education and example. The emperor understood that forced conversion would only create resentment and instability, while gradual, voluntary adoption would create more sincere and reliable adherence to the faith. This tolerant approach extended to local customs and traditions as well. The emperor allowed regional leaders to maintain many of their traditional practices and authorities, provided these did not conflict with imperial law or threaten the stability of the realm. Local festivals and ceremonies continued to be celebrated. Local languages were preserved and respected, and traditional forms of social organization were allowed to persist alongside the new imperial institutions. The emperor's court itself reflected this diversity, with advisors and officials drawn from across the empire's ethnic and regional spectrum. The Songhai people, as the empire's founders and rulers, naturally held prominent positions, but they shared power and influence with manned merchants, Fulani, herders, Tuareg guides, and representatives of dozens of smaller groups. This inclusive approach to governance not only reduced the likelihood of regional rebellions, but also ensured that imperial policies would be informed by the knowledge and perspectives of all the empire's peoples. The emperor's military organization, similarly, reflected his commitment to diversity. While the core of the imperial army consisted of professional soldiers drawn primarily from the Songhai people, the emperor also maintained specialized units that took advantage of different groups' particular skills. Tuareg cavalry provided unmatched mobility and desert warfare expertise, while Sorko sailors operated the river vessels that gave the empire control over the Niger. Local militias were organized throughout the empire, allowing different regions to contribute to their own defense while maintaining connections to the imperial military structure. This system of inclusive governance created a sense of shared stake in the empire's success that proved remarkably durable. Rather than viewing imperial rule as foreign domination, most of the empire's peoples came to see themselves as participants in a grand collaborative project that offered opportunities for prosperity and advancement that would have been impossible in smaller, isolated communities. The emperor's court became a destination for ambitious young people from throughout the empire, creating networks of personal loyalty and mutual interest that strengthened imperial unity. As Askia, Muhammad's reign progressed into its second decade, the fruits of his patient and systematic approach to governance became increasingly apparent. The empire that had emerged from the chaos following Sunni Ali's death had been transformed into a realm of unprecedented stability and prosperity. Cities grew and flourished, trade routes hummed with activity, and the centers of learning that the emperor had established attracted scholars and students from across the known world. The emperor's capital at Gao had grown into a magnificent city that rivaled any in Africa or the Middle East. The imperial palace complex, expanded and beautified throughout the emperor's reign, displayed the sophisticated architectural traditions that had developed in West Africa over centuries of cultural exchange. The palace's great hall, where the emperor held court and received foreign dignitaries, was renowned for its elegant proportions and intricate decorative work that combined Islamic geometric patterns with distinctly African motifs. The city's markets showcased the empire's commercial success, with goods from across the known world available to those who could afford them. The sounds of different languages filled the air as merchants from North Africa bargained with their West African counterparts, while scholars from Timbuktu discussed philosophy with visitors from Cairo or Cordoba. The diversity of the crowds that filled Gao's streets served as daily testimony to the emperor's success in creating a realm that attracted people from throughout the medieval world. The emperor himself, now in his 50s, had grown into the role of sage ruler that his subjects and foreign observers increasingly recognized. His court sessions were famous for their careful deliberation and wise judgments, while his private discussions with scholars and advisors revealed a mind that remained curious and engaged despite the burdens of governing such a vast empire. Foreign visitors invariably commented on the emperor's dignity and wisdom, noting that he combined the authority of absolute power with the humility of deep learning. The emperor's family had also grown into important figures in the empire's governance. His sons, educated in the Islamic schools that their father had established, combined traditional Songhai warrior training with the scholarly pursuits that the emperor valued so highly. They served as provincial governors and military commanders, extending the emperor's influence while gaining the experience that would prepare them for future leadership roles. The emperor's daughters, though not granted formal political positions according to the customs of the time, played important informal roles in the diplomatic and cultural life of the court. As the emperor looked out from his palace across the bustling city of Gao, and the fertile lands that stretched to the horizon. He could take satisfaction in the knowledge that his life's work had succeeded beyond even his most ambitious dreams. The empire that he had inherited as a prize of war had been transformed into a beacon of learning, prosperity, and just governance that illuminated the medieval world. The institutions he had created, the scholars he had supported, and the traditions he had established would endure long after his own earthly journey had ended, continuing to guide and inspire future generations of Africans and Muslims alike. Yet even as he savored these achievements, the emperor remained aware that the work of building and maintaining a great empire was never complete. New challenges would arise, requiring new solutions and adaptations. The empire's very success had made it a target for enemies who coveted its wealth and envied its power. The delicate balance between unity and diversity that he had worked so carefully to maintain would require constant attention from his successors. The institutions he had created would need to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances if they were to remain effective. But for now, in the golden afternoon of his reign, Askia Muhammad could rest in the knowledge that he had given his people and his faith a gift of immeasurable value. A kingdom where justice prevailed, learning flourished, and people of all backgrounds could find opportunities to pursue their dreams and fulfill their potential. The empire that bore his stamp would face many trials in the years ahead, but it would face them with the strength and wisdom that his long and thoughtful reign had built into its very foundations. In the golden chambers of Gao, where the morning light filtered through latticed windows and cast patterns upon carpets woven with threads of empire, the great Askia Muhammad grew old. His hands, once steady upon the reins of conquest, trembled now as they held the scrolls of state. His eyes, which had gazed upon the vast stretches of his domain from the salt mines of Tagaza to the forests of the south, dimmed with the weight of years and the burden of absolute power. The empire he had built stretched like a great tapestry across the face of West Africa, its threads golden with trade routes and silver with the Niger's flowing waters. Yet within the palace walls, shadows gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. His sons moved through the corridors with the careful grace of lions circling a throne, their eyes bright with ambition and their hearts heavy with the knowledge that only one could inherit the vast realm their father had forged. Muhammad's eldest son Musa walked the gardens in the pre-dawn hours, his sandaled feet silent upon the stone pathways. The scent of jasmine and orange blossoms filled the air, but his mind was consumed with thoughts of succession. He had watched his father transform from warrior to statesman, from conqueror to patron of learning, and he wondered if he possessed the strength to hold together an empire that spanned 1,000 miles and encompassed 12 peoples. The court whispered of the old emperor's failing health, though none dared speak such words aloud. Ministers glided through the palace like ghosts, their loyalty uncertain as the desert winds. Some aligned themselves with Prince Musa, seeing in him the natural heir to power. Others favored younger sons, believing fresh blood might better serve an empire grown perhaps too large for any single man to govern in 1528. As the rains came late to the Sahel, and the people looked to the skies for signs of divine favor, the inevitable moment arrived. The great Askia Muhammad, the man who had transformed Songhai from a river kingdom into an empire that rivaled any power on earth, breathed his last in the privacy of his chambers. The news spread through Gao like wildfire, carried by servants and soldiers, merchants and scholars, each understanding that an era had ended and uncertainty had begun. Prince Musa moved swiftly to claim his inheritance. But power in Songhai had never transferred smoothly from father to son. The empire's complex structure of provincial governors, military commanders, and religious authorities each possessed their own interests and allegiances. What followed was not the orderly succession of a stable monarchy, but a carefully orchestrated coup that would forever change the character of the empire. Askia Musa ascended to the throne amid ceremonies that blended Islamic ritual with ancient Songhai traditions. The drums of Gao echoed across the waters of the Niger as representatives from the farthest provinces traveled to pay homage to their new emperor. Yet even as the praise singers recounted the glories of the Askia dynasty and the courtiers bowed in obeisance, the foundations of imperial unity showed signs of strain. Musa possessed neither his father's military genius nor his gift for administration, where Muhammad had been both warrior and scholar, equally comfortable leading cavalry charges and debating points of Islamic law. His son seemed diminished by the vast responsibilities thrust upon him. The provincial governors, men who had served the old emperor with absolute loyalty, began to question the authority of this untested ruler. The new Askia attempted to maintain his father's policies, continuing the support for Islamic scholarship in Timbuktu and preserving the complex administrative system that kept tribute flowing from distant provinces. Yet his reign was marked by a subtle but growing disconnection between the central government and the outlying regions of the empire. Local chiefs, who had once traveled regularly to Gao to renew their oaths of allegiance, found excuses to delay their visits in Timbuktu. The scholars of Sankha noted with concern the declining quality of correspondence from the imperial court, where Muhammad's letters had been masterpieces of Arabic prose, filled with theological insight and practical wisdom. His son's communications seemed perfunctory and uncertain. The great libraries that had flourished under imperial patronage began to worry about their future funding, though none dared voice such concerns openly. The economy, that great engine of imperial power built upon the trans-Saharan trade routes, continued to function through the momentum of established custom and the expertise of merchant families who had served the empire for generations. Caravans still departed from Timbuktu, laden with gold and ivory, returning months later with horses and salt, manufactured goods and books. Yet the merchants noted a growing tendency toward local taxation, as provincial governors sought to supplement their incomes from imperial sources that seemed less reliable than before. Musa's reign lasted only 3 years, but they were years that revealed fundamental weaknesses in the imperial system. The empire had grown too large and complex to be governed by personal charisma alone. It required institutions, legal frameworks, and administrative competence that could survive changes. In leadership, these elements had existed during Muhammad's reign, but they had been held together by the force of his personality and his unquestioned authority. In 1531, the inevitable crisis arrived. A coalition of military commanders and provincial governors, led by Prince Muhammad Benken, one of the old emperor's younger sons, declared their lack of confidence in Musa's leadership. What followed was not a civil war in the traditional sense, but rather a palace revolution that demonstrated how fragile imperial unity had become. Muhammad Benken, known to history as Askia Benken, ascended to power with promises of reform and renewed imperial vigor. He was a man of middle years, seasoned by service in the provincial administration and respected by the military establishment that had grown restless under his brother's ineffective rule. His supporters believed he possessed the qualities necessary to restore the empire to its former greatness. The new Askia's first actions revealed both his strengths and the challenges facing any ruler of Songhai. He reorganized the provincial administration, replacing governors whose loyalty was questionable with men drawn from his own circle of supporters. This move strengthened central control in the short term, but created lasting resentments among the displaced officials and their extended families. Benken understood that military strength remained the foundation of imperial power. He invested heavily in upgrading the empire's armed forces, expanding the cavalry units that patrolled the trade routes and strengthening the river fleet that controlled commerce along the Niger. New fortifications were constructed at strategic points, and the imperial arsenals were stocked with the finest weapons available from North African suppliers. Yet, even as he strengthened the military foundations of his rule, Benken faced challenges that no amount of force could entirely resolve. The empire's vast size made communication slow and coordination difficult. Messages between Gao and the westernmost provinces could take weeks to travel, and by the time instructions arrived, circumstances had often changed dramatically. The Askia attempted to address this problem through administrative innovation, establishing a more systematic approach to imperial governance. He created new departments within the central government, each responsible for specific aspects of imperial administration. The Ministry of Trade oversaw commercial policy and taxation, while the Ministry of Justice administered the complex legal system that blended Islamic law with local customs. Religious policy under Benken represented a careful balance between Islamic orthodoxy and traditional practices. He continued his father's support for Islamic scholarship, while tolerating the ancestral beliefs that remained strong among the rural population. This pragmatic approach helped maintain social stability but did not entirely satisfy either the Islamic scholars who sought stricter adherence to religious law or the traditionalists who feared the gradual erosion of ancient customs. Benken's reign lasted 6 years, during which the empire maintained its territorial extent and economic prosperity. Yet his rule was marked by a growing sense that Songhai had reached the limits of sustainable expansion. The costs of maintaining control over such a vast territory were enormous, requiring constant military vigilance and administrative attention that strained the resources even of this wealthy empire. In 1537, another succession crisis shook the foundations of imperial power. Askia Benken's death brought to the throne his nephew, Ismail, a young man whose brief reign would be remembered more for its promise than its achievements. Ismail represented a new generation of Songhai leadership, educated in both Islamic scholarship and traditional statecraft, fluent in Arabic and Songhai, equally comfortable in the mosques of Timbuktu and the ancestral shrines of the Niger Bend. The new Askia inherited an empire that remained superficially prosperous but showed subtle signs of internal strain. The great cities continued to thrive, their markets filled with goods from across Africa and beyond. Timbuktu's reputation as a center of learning remained undiminished, its libraries and schools attracting students from throughout the Islamic world. Yet beneath this surface prosperity, fundamental problems festered like hidden wounds. Ismail recognized these challenges and attempted to address them through a series of ambitious reforms. He established new schools in provincial cities, hoping to create a more educated administrative class that could serve imperial interests throughout the vast territory. He reformed the tax system, attempting to make it more equitable and efficient. Most importantly, he tried to strengthen the bonds between the imperial center and the outlying provinces through a program of regular ceremonial visits and renewed oaths of allegiance. The young emperor's vision encompassed not merely the preservation of existing power, but its transformation into something more sustainable and just. He dreamed of an empire united not merely by force and economic interest, but by shared values and common identity. His correspondence with provincial governors spoke of the peoples of Songhai as members of a single great family, bound together by bonds stronger than mere political convenience. Yet dreams, however noble, could not overcome the practical realities of governing a continental empire with medieval technology and limited communication. Ismail's reforms, though well-intentioned, often created more problems than they solved. New taxes generated resentment among populations already burdened by the costs of imperial administration. Educational initiatives, while admirable in principle, strained imperial finances and created expectations that could not easily be fulfilled. The emperor's attempts to strengthen ties with provincial governors sometimes backfired, as local leaders interpreted imperial attention as interference in their traditional autonomy. The delicate balance between central authority and provincial independence, carefully maintained by previous rulers, began to shift in ways that pleased no one entirely. Ismail's reign lasted only 2 years, ending in 1539 under circumstances that historians would long debate. Some accounts suggest natural death, others hint at palace intrigue and political assassination. What remains certain is that his death marked another turning point in the dynasty's history. Another moment when the empire's future hung in the balance. From the uncertainty that followed Ismail's death emerged Askia Ishakai, a ruler whose 10-year reign would represent the last period of genuine stability in the empire's history. Ishak possessed the political wisdom to understand that Songhai's survival depended not on grand reforms or ambitious expansion, but on the careful preservation of existing strengths and the gradual adaptation to changing circumstances. The new Askia implemented a policy of consolidation, focusing on strengthening control over the empire's core territories rather than pursuing further conquest. He understood that Songhai had reached the practical limits of expansion given the technology and administrative capacity available to medieval African states. Better to govern effectively what already belonged to the empire than to risk everything in pursuit of additional territories that could not be properly controlled. Under Ishak's rule, the great cities of the empire experienced a final flowering of prosperity and cultural achievement. Timbuktu reached perhaps the zenith of its fame as a center of Islamic learning, its Sanka University attracting scholars from as far away as Cairo and Baghdad. The libraries of the city contained hundreds of thousands of books, manuscripts copied and preserved by generations of devoted scholars who saw themselves as guardians of human knowledge. The intellectual life of Timbuktu during this period represented one of the great achievements of medieval African civilization. Scholars debated questions of theology and law, astronomy and mathematics, history and literature. They produced original works that advanced human understanding in numerous fields, from advanced mathematical treatises to sophisticated historical chronicles that preserve for posterity the story of their remarkable empire. Gen, the other great intellectual center of the empire, also flourished under Ishak's patronage. The city's scholars specialized particularly in legal studies, producing commentaries on Islamic law that were consulted throughout West Africa. The great mosque of Gen, rebuilt during this period, stood as a magnificent example of Sudanic architecture. Its towering walls and distinctive minarets, proclaiming the city's devotion to Islamic faith and learning, dot the economy during Ishak's reign remained fundamentally healthy. Built as it was on the solid foundation of trans-Saharan trade, that had enriched West African empires for centuries. Gold from the southern forests continued to flow northward through Songhai territory, exchanged with increasing sophistication for manufactured goods, horses, salt, and books from North Africa and beyond. The empire's position astride the major trade routes remained its greatest source of strength. Yet even during this period of apparent stability, careful observers could detect signs of approaching trouble. The Portuguese presence on the West African coast was beginning to affect traditional trade patterns, as some gold that had previously traveled north across the Sahara now moved south to Atlantic ports. This shift was gradual and not immediately threatening, but it represented a long-term challenge to the economic foundations of Songhai power. More immediately concerning were the growing signs of internal division within the empire. The Askia Dynasty's frequent succession crises had created multiple branches of the royal family, each with legitimate claims to power and their own networks of supporters. These competing factions remained relatively quiet during Ishak's effective reign, but they represented a potential source of future instability. In 1549, the throne passed to Askia Daud, whose 33-year reign would represent both the final golden age of Songhai and the beginning of its irreversible decline. Daud inherited an empire that remained territorially intact and economically prosperous, but he would witness the gradual erosion of the conditions that had made such prosperity possible. The new Askia possessed many of the qualities that had made his predecessors successful. He was an able military commander, a patron of learning, and a skilled diplomat who understood the complex relationships that bound together the empire's diverse peoples. Under his rule, the great cities continued to prosper, trade remained profitable, and the empire's borders stayed secure. Against external threats, Daud's reign saw the continuation of Songhai's remarkable cultural achievements. The scholars of Timbuktu produced some of their finest works during this period, including historical chronicles that provide modern historians with invaluable insights into the empire's development. The Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Fatash, two of the most important sources for understanding medieval West African history, were compiled during or shortly after this era. The emperor himself was a learned man who took personal interest in scholarly debates and religious questions. His court became a center of intellectual discourse, where scholars, poets, and theologians gathered to discuss the great questions of their time. This patronage of learning represented one of the most admirable aspects of Songhai civilization, demonstrating that military and commercial success could coexist with genuine intellectual achievement. Yet beneath the surface prosperity of Daud's long reign, fundamental changes were reshaping the world in ways that would ultimately prove fatal to Songhai's independence. The Portuguese expansion along the African coast was gradually redirecting trade flows away from the trans-Saharan routes that had been the empire's lifeblood. More ominously, the rise of Morocco as a unified and militarily powerful state was creating a new threat from the north. The Moroccan state that emerged in the 16th century was fundamentally different from earlier North African powers. The Saadian dynasty that ruled Morocco had successfully unified the country under effective central control and had begun to modernize its military forces with the latest European weapons and techniques. Unlike previous North African states, which had been content to trade peacefully with their southern neighbors, the new Morocco harbored territorial ambitions that directly threatened Songhai interests. The first clear sign of this new threat came in the form of Moroccan raids on the salt mines of Tagaza, the deposits in the northern Sahara that provided Songhai with one of its most important trade commodities. These raids, beginning in the later years of Daud's reign, were initially seen as minor border incidents rather than harbingers of a larger conflict. Yet they represented a fundamental challenge to Songhai's economic interests and territorial integrity. Daoud attempted to respond to the Moroccan threat through diplomacy, sending embassies to the Sardian court to negotiate agreements that would preserve the status quo. These diplomatic initiatives revealed the empire's essential weakness in dealing with a modernized opponent, where Songhai relied on traditional methods of warfare and diplomacy. Morocco possessed firearms, artillery, and military techniques learned from Ottoman and European models. The technological gap between the two powers was not immediately apparent, as Songhai remained militarily formidable by the standards of medieval African warfare. The empire's cavalry remained effective against traditional opponents, and its control of river transport gave it significant advantages in its home territory. Yet these traditional strengths would prove inadequate against an enemy equipped with gunpowder weapons and trained in modern military tactics. As Daoud's reign entered its final years, the signs of approaching crisis multiplied like gathering clouds before a desert storm. The emperor, now aged and increasingly dependent on advisors and provincial governors, struggled to maintain the unity and effectiveness that had characterized earlier periods of his rule. The vast administrative apparatus of the empire, built up over generations of successful rulers, began to show signs of strain under the pressure of external threats and internal divisions. The Moroccan pressure on Songhai's northern frontiers continued to intensify throughout the 1570s and early 1580s. What had begun as isolated raids on salt mines evolved into a systematic campaign to control the trans-Saharan trade routes that were the foundation of both empires' prosperity. The Saadian rulers in Morocco had developed a coherent strategy for expanding their influence southward, viewing control of the gold trade as essential to their own imperial ambitions. Within Songhai itself, the prolonged external pressure began to reveal internal weaknesses that had been masked by decades of prosperity and stability. The empire's federal structure, which had been a source of strength when all components were united behind effective central leadership, became a vulnerability when that leadership was challenged by unprecedented external threats. Provincial governors, faced with the need to defend their own territories against Moroccan incursions, began to prioritize local interests over imperial unity. The complex system of tribute and obligation that bound the outlying provinces to the imperial center started to break down as resources were diverted to immediate defense needs rather than central coffers. The economic foundations of imperial power also showed signs of stress during this period. The trans-Saharan trade that had been the engine of Songhai prosperity was being disrupted by military conflict and the FHO of further Moroccan expansion. Merchants, always sensitive to political instability, began to seek alternative routes and arrangements that would protect their investments from the growing chaos in traditional trading areas. The scholarly communities of Timbuktu and Gen, which had flourished under imperial patronage for more than a century, began to feel the effects of these economic and political pressures. Imperial funding for schools and libraries became less reliable, and some scholars began to emigrate to safer regions where their work could continue without the constant threat of military disruption. Perhaps most ominously for the empire's future, the royal family itself began to fragment. Under the pressure of external threats and the strain of governing an increasingly ungovernable realm, different branches of the Askia dynasty began to develop competing visions for how the empire should respond to the Moroccan threat, with some favoring accommodation and others calling for militant resistance. These internal divisions within the ruling family reflected broader disagreements throughout Songhai society about how to respond to the unprecedented challenges facing the empire. Some voices called for military modernization, arguing that Songhai needed to acquire firearms and modern military techniques to compete with Morocco on equal terms. Others insisted that traditional methods of warfare and diplomacy would prove adequate if properly applied. When Askia died in 1582, he left behind an empire that remained formally intact but faced challenges that would test every aspect of its strength and resilience. The question of succession, always difficult in Songhai politics, became particularly critical at a moment when effective leadership was more essential than ever before. The death of Askia marked the end of the last stable reign in Songhai. What followed was a succession crisis that revealed the full extent of the empire's internal weaknesses at precisely the moment when external threats demanded maximum unity and effectiveness. The various claimants to the throne each represented different approaches to the challenges facing the empire, but none possessed the authority or resources necessary to hold together the vast and complex realm their predecessors had created. The immediate successor to Daud was his son Muhammad Boni, whose brief reign was characterized by indecision and internal conflict. Boni faced the impossible task of defending an empire under attack while simultaneously trying to establish his own legitimacy as ruler. The Moroccan threat, which had been manageable during his father's long reign, had evolved into an existential crisis that demanded immediate and decisive action. Yet decisive action was precisely what the fractured imperial system could no longer provide. The provincial governors, faced with direct threats to their own territories, increasingly acted independently of central authority. Military commanders found themselves torn between loyalty to competing claimants to the throne and the immediate needs of defending their assigned territories against Moroccan forces. The economic disruption caused by prolonged military conflict began to undermine the material foundations of imperial power. Trade routes that had operated profitably for centuries became hazardous and unpredictable. The steady flow of tribute from outlying provinces, which had funded the imperial administration and military for generations, slowed to a trickle as local resources were consumed by defense needs. In this context of mounting crisis, Muhammad Boni's reign lasted less than 2 years before he was succeeded by Askia II in 1588. The new emperor inherited a situation that was rapidly becoming untenable, with Moroccan forces operating freely in the northern territories of the empire and internal unity dissolving under the pressure of competing loyalties and interests. Ishak II represented perhaps the last hope for Songhai independence, a ruler who understood both the magnitude of the threat facing his empire and the urgent need for fundamental changes in how that empire was governed and defended. Yet by the time he came to power, the window for effective reform had largely closed. The Moroccan advance had gained too much momentum, and internal divisions had gone too far to be easily reversed. The new Askia attempted to rally his empire for a final defense against the Moroccan invasion, calling upon the traditional loyalties and shared interests that had bound together the diverse peoples of Songhai for more than a century. His appeals met with partial success, as many provincial governors and military commanders recognized that their own survival depended on the survival of the empire as a whole. Yet the response to this final call for unity revealed how much had changed since the days of the great emperor Muhammad. Where once the empire could field massive armies drawn from across its territories, now each province could spare only limited forces without leaving itself defenseless. Where once the imperial treasury could fund major military campaigns, now resources were so depleted that even basic defensive preparations strained the empire's finances. As 1590 dawned, the empire of Songhai stood at the threshold of its final crisis. For more than a century, it had dominated the Niger bend and controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. Its cities had been centers of learning and commerce. Its armies had been feared throughout West Africa, and its rulers had commanded the respect of powers from Morocco to Egypt. Now, all of this was about to be tested by an enemy equipped with weapons and tactics that represented a new age of warfare. The traditional strengths that had made Songhai great, its control of river transport, its skilled cavalry, its complex diplomatic relationships, would soon prove inadequate against an opponent that fought by different rules and possessed technologies that the empire had never encountered on such a scale. In the great palace at Gao, as the final winter of Songhai independence settled over the Niger Valley, Askia Ishak II prepared his empire for a battle that would determine not merely the fate of his dynasty but the future of an entire civilization. The weight of 5 centuries of achievement rested upon his shoulders, and the hopes of millions of his subjects looked at him for salvation from the storm that was about to break upon their world. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath them. The Niger flowed as it always had, carrying the hopes and dreams of the people who lived along its banks toward an uncertain future. And in the distance, barely audible above the night sounds of the great city, came the faint echo of marching feet and the glint of steel in the moonlight. The final act of the Songhai Empire was about to begin, and morning would bring with it the end of an age that had known glory beyond measure and achievement that would echo through the centuries long. After the last emperor had fallen, and the great cities had surrendered to silence and sand. The turning of the 16th century brought with it winds that carried more than sand across the Sahara. In the courts of Marrakesh, far to the north, Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur al-Dahabi sat upon his throne, his gaze fixed not on the Atlantic waters that lapped at Morocco's western shores, but upon the golden heart of the Sudan that lay beyond the desert's vastness. The wealth of Songhai, spoken of in whispered tales by caravan masters who had witnessed the splendor of Timbuktu and Gao, had become more than legend in the Sultan's mind. It had become necessity. The Battle of Al-Qasaqibiyah in 1578 had left Morocco victorious against Portuguese ambitions. Yet the cost of such triumph had drained the royal treasury like water disappearing into desert sand. The cannons that had thundered against European invaders now stood silent, their bronze mouths hungry for purpose. The soldiers who had tasted victory found themselves with empty purses, their valor rewarded with promises rather than gold. In this moment of financial desperation, the Sultan's eyes turned southward, toward the empire that controlled the ancient trade routes where gold flowed like the Niger's waters. Ahmad al-Mansur, whose name meant the victorious, understood that true victory required more than battlefield prowess, demanded the wealth to sustain power. The trans-Saharan trade that had enriched the kingdoms of the Sudan for centuries called to him like a siren's song. Salt from Tagaza, gold from Bambuk, slaves from the southern riches. All of these riches passed through Songhai hands, creating a prosperity that seemed to mock Morocco's empty coffers. In the year 1590, as the seasons turned and the hot winds began their annual journey across the continent, the Sultan made his fateful decision. The expedition that would change the course of West African history began not with the clash of arms, but but with the quiet consultation of maps in palace, chambers where shadows danced by lamplight. The route was traced with careful fingers across the Atlas Mountains, through the endless Sahara, past the salt mines of Tagaza, and finally to the bend of the Niger where Songhai's cities gleamed like jewels in the desert crown. The man chosen to lead this ambitious venture was Judah Pasha, a figure whose very existence embodied the complex nature of the coming conflict. Born Spanish, captured as a child, raised Muslim, and now serving as a general in the Moroccan army, Judah represented the cultural crossroads that defined North Africa in this age of transformation. His appointment spoke to the Sultan's understanding that this would be no ordinary military campaign, but rather a clash between civilizations, between the traditional power of West African kingdoms and the emerging strength of North African states armed with European technology. As preparations began in earnest, the markets of Marrakesh and Fez buzzed with activity. Arquebuses were gathered and tested, their mechanisms carefully maintained by skilled craftsmen who understood that mechanical failure in the Sahara meant death. Cannons were mounted on special carriages designed to traverse sand dunes, their bronze barrels gleaming with oil and care. Supplies were calculated with mathematical precision. Water, food, powder, shot each item weighed against the brutal reality of desert crossing. The soldiers who would undertake this journey came from diverse backgrounds, united only by their service to the Sultan and their need for the promised rewards. Some were veterans of European campaigns, their beards grey with the wisdom of many battles. Others were young men seeking glory and fortune, their eyes bright with ambition and ignorance of the trials that awaited them. Among them walked Christian renegades, former prisoners who had converted to Islam and now served their former captors with the fervor of the converted. Turkish janissaries lent their disciplined expertise to the expedition, their distinctive caps and robes adding an exotic element to the gathering force. Yet beneath the martial preparations, deeper currents flowed. The religious character of the coming conflict could not be ignored. For both Morocco and Songhai were Muslim lands, their rulers claiming to serve Allah and follow the path of the Prophet. The scholars and Qadis of Marrakesh engaged in theological debates about the justification for such a campaign. Some argued that the Songhai rulers, particularly the memory of Sunni Ali with his syncretistic practices, had strayed from true Islamic orthodoxy. Others contended that economic necessity provided sufficient justification for war against fellow Muslims. These religious considerations were not merely academic exercises, for they would influence how the invasion was conducted and how it would be remembered. The Sultan needed not only military victory but also religious legitimacy, particularly given the Islamic character of the lands he sought to conquer. The presence of Islamic scholars and judges in Timbuktu, the renowned Sankha University, and the generally Muslim character of Songhai's urban populations complicated the moral landscape of the invasion as 1590 drew to its close. The expedition reached its final stages of preparation. 4,000 men had been assembled, a relatively small force by the standards of European warfare, but representing a significant investment for Morocco. More importantly, these men carried with them technology that would prove decisive in the coming conflict. 600 arquebuses gleamed in the supply trains, their long barrels capable of sending death across distances that traditional African warfare had never experienced. 8 bronze cannons, each a masterpiece of European metallurgy, waited to demonstrate the power of gunpowder against earthen walls and cavalry charges. The irony of the situation was not lost on contemporary observers. Morocco, having successfully resisted European colonization through the use of European military technology, now prepared to use that same technology against African kingdoms that had previously remained beyond European reach. The arquebuses and cannons that would soon thunder across the Sudan were products of the same industrial and technical revolution that had brought Portuguese sailors to the African coast and Spanish conquistadors to the Americas. On October 16, 1590, the expedition departed from Marrakesh in the cool pre-dawn darkness. The sound of horses, hooves, camels, bells, and men's voices created a symphony of departure that echoed through the city's narrow streets. Citizens emerged from their homes to witness the spectacle, some offering prayers for the soldiers' success, others quietly wondering whether they were witnessing the beginning of a great victory or a great catastrophe. The crossing of the Atlas Mountains presented the first test of the expedition's resolve. Snow-capped peaks that had witnessed the passage of countless armies throughout history now watched as this latest force made its way through passes carved by centuries of wind and weather. The altitude affected both men and animals, while the autumn chill reminded everyone that winter was approaching. Adding urgency to their mission, beyond the mountains lay the Sahara, that greatest of natural barriers that had both connected and divided North and West Africa for millennia. The desert that had enriched caravan traders and buried the bones of the unwary now stretched before Judah's army like an ocean of sand and stone. Here, European military technology would face its first real test against African geography. The march across the Sahara became an epic of endurance that would be remembered long after the battles that followed. Water, that most precious of desert commodities, had to be carefully rationed and jealously guarded. The heavy bronze cannons that would prove so decisive in battle became almost unbearable burdens as they were dragged across endless dunes. Horses, bred for the green valleys of Morocco, suffered terribly in the desert heat, many dying along the route despite the best efforts of their handlers. Yet the army pressed on, driven by the promise of the riches that awaited them in the Sudan. The first major test came at Tagaza, the salt mining center that had long served as a way station for trans-Saharan caravans. The mines, with their white pyramids of salt gleaming in the desert sun, represented the beginning of Songhai's wealth, and the first tangible sign that the expedition was approaching its goal. The capture of Tagaza in 1591 served as both a practical and symbolic victory for the Moroccan forces. Practically, it secured a vital source of the salt that formed one pillar of West African trade. Symbolically, it announced to the world that the age of Songhai's unchallenged dominance over the trans-Saharan routes had ended. The workers in the salt mines, many of whom were slaves from various parts of West Africa, found themselves under new masters whose intentions toward their homeland were far from benevolent. News of Tagaza's fall spread southward faster than the Moroccan army itself could march. Along the Niger's banks, in the markets of Timbuktu and the palace halls of Gao, the implications of this development were debated with growing anxiety. Some councillors argued that the Moroccans, having secured the salt mines, might be satisfied with this economic prize and retreat northward. Others, more prescient in their analysis, understood that Tagaza represented merely the first course in a feast that would not end until the Moroccans had consumed all of Songhai's wealth. In Gao, the great capital that had witnessed the rise and glory of the Songhai Empire, Askia Ishak received the reports from Tagaza with the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders. The last of the great Askias, he had inherited not only a throne, but also the burden of defending an empire that had already begun to show the cracks that would soon become chasms. The civil wars that had plagued Songhai since the death of Askia, Daud in 1582, had weakened the state's military capacity and divided its nobility at the very moment when unity was most essential. Ishaq too was a ruler caught between worlds and times, raised in the Islamic traditions that Askia Muhammad had established nearly a century earlier. He understood the religious and cultural connections that bound Songhai to the broader Islamic world. Yet these same connections now worked against him. For the Moroccan invasion came not from pagan enemies who could be fought without moral complexity, but from fellow Muslims whose claim to Islamic legitimacy was difficult to refute. The military situation facing the last Askia was both familiar and unprecedented. Familiar because Songhai had always faced external threats from the Mossi to the south, the Tuareg to the north, various rebellious provinces within the empire itself. Unprecedented because never before had an enemy approached armed with the technological advantages that the Moroccans now possessed. The arquebuses and cannons that had proven their worth in North African campaigns against European forces represented a quantum leap in military capability that traditional African warfare was ill-equipped to counter. I's response to the crisis revealed both the strengths and limitations of Songhai's military system. The empire's ability to mobilize large numbers of warriors remained impressive. Estimates suggest that over 40,000 men eventually answered the Askia's call to arms. These included the traditional cavalry forces that had formed the backbone of Songhai military power since the time of Sonni Ali, infantry armed with spears and bows that had served West African warfare for centuries, and even war canoes that controlled the Niger's waterways. The Songhai military gathered at Tundabi, a site chosen for its strategic advantages in traditional forms of warfare. Located on the Niger's banks northwest of Gao, the position offered access to water, good ground for cavalry maneuvers, and the possibility of retreat by river if necessary. Yet these advantages, calculated according to the logic of pre-gun warfare, would prove irrelevant in the face of the technological revolution that was about to be unleashed. As the two armies approached their fateful encounter, the contrast between them represented more than military difference. It embodied the collision between two eras in African history. The Songhai forces, with their colorful robes and traditional weapons, their horses and spears and arrows, represented the culmination of centuries of West African military development. The Moroccan army, smaller in number but equipped with European firearms, represented the intrusion of a new age in which technological advantage could overcome numerical superiority. The psychological aspects of the coming battle cannot be underestimated. Many Songhai warriors had never seen firearms in action, let alone experienced their devastating effects in battle. The thunderous roar of cannons, the smoke and flame of arquebuses, the alien smell of gunpowder, all of these would create a sensory assault unlike anything in traditional African warfare. Conversely, the Moroccan soldiers, despite their technological advantages, were fighting far from home in an alien landscape against enemies whose knowledge of local conditions far exceeded their own. The diplomatic efforts that preceded the battle revealed the complex motivations driving both sides. Judar Pasha, conscious of his small army's isolation deep in Africa, made overtures to Ishaq that suggested the possibility of accommodation. Perhaps the Songhai could acknowledge Moroccan suzerainty while maintaining internal autonomy. Perhaps tribute could be arranged that would satisfy Moroccan financial needs without requiring the complete destruction of Songhai independence. These negotiations, conducted through intermediaries and marked by the careful protocols of Islamic diplomacy, ultimately failed because the fundamental interests of the two sides proved irreconcilable. Morocco needed not just acknowledgement of its power, but actual control over the trade routes and wealth that had motivated the expedition in the first place. Songhai could not surrender the economic foundations of its power without ceasing to be an empire worthy of the name, as March 1591 progressed toward its climax. Both armies completed their preparations with the solemnity appropriate to warriors who understood that the coming battle would determine the future of West Africa. The Songhai forces performed traditional ceremonies intended to ensure divine favor, while Islamic prayers rose from both camps as Muslims prepared to fight. Muslims in a conflict that would reshape the religious as well as political landscape of the Sudan. The irony of the situation was profound. Both armies served Allah, both followed the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, both observed the same festivals and faced Mecca in their daily prayers. Yet economic necessity and political ambition had brought them to this point where Islamic brotherhood would be forgotten in pursuit of worldly advantage. The tragedy was not just military but spiritual, representing a failure of the Islamic ideal of unity in the face of material temptation. The 13th of March, 1591, dawned clear and cool across the bend of the Niger River, the air carrying the promise of heat that would come with the advancing day. At Tundubi, the two armies that would determine the fate of West Africa faced each other across a plain that had witnessed countless seasons of planting and harvest, but never such a gathering of armed men with such momentous purposes. The Songhai army presented a magnificent spectacle in the early morning light. 40,000 warriors stretched across the landscape in formations that reflected centuries of military tradition. The cavalry, mounted on horses whose bloodlines traced back to Arab and Berber stock, formed the army's striking force. Their riders, many of whom were nobles of the empire, wore robes of brilliant colors, deep blues and rich crimsons, bright yellows and pristine whites that caught the sunlight like banners of defiance. Behind the cavalry stood the infantry, armed with iron-tipped spears that gleamed like a forest of metal in the morning sun. Many carried shields of leather reinforced with metal studs, their surfaces decorated with geometric patterns that spoke of the artistic traditions of the Sudan. Archers, their bows strung and quivers full, provided the army's long-range capability, while drummers stood ready to signal commands across the vast array of forces. The sight must have been both inspiring and sobering to Askia, Ishak too, as he surveyed his army from horseback. Here was the military might of an empire that had dominated West Africa for over a century, the culmination of the military system that Sunni Ali had forged and Askia Muhammad had perfected. Yet the Askia's experienced eye could also see the weaknesses that threatened to undermine this impressive display: the lack of unity among commanders who had recently been enemies in civil war, the absence of the firearms that reports from Tagaza suggested would be crucial in the coming battle. Across the plain, the Moroccan army presented a starkly different appearance. 4,000 men seemed almost insignificant compared to the Songhai host, yet their formation spoke of different priorities and capabilities. The most obvious difference lay in the weapons they carried. 600 arquebusiers formed the army's core, their long firearms gleaming with oil and careful maintenance. These men, trained in the precise drill that gunpowder warfare required, stood in ranks that European observers would have recognized immediately. The 8 bronze cannons that had been dragged across the Sahara at such enormous cost now stood, ready to justify that expense. Each cannon represented a significant investment in European metallurgy and military engineering. Their bronze barrels capable of hurling iron balls with devastating effect. The gunners who served these weapons brought with them expertise gained in the Mediterranean warfare that had shaped Morocco's military development. Between the two armies lay not just physical space, but a gulf of military philosophy and technological development. The Songhai forces, for all their numbers and courage, were organized according to principles of warfare that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The Moroccans, despite their smaller numbers, represented the cutting edge of military innovation. The application of European gunpowder technology to African conquest. The battle began. As so many battles do, with preliminary movements that seemed almost ritualistic in their formality. Songhai cavalry advanced in demonstration of their traditional superiority, their horses dancing and prancing in displays meant to intimidate the enemy and inspire their own forces. The sight of 40,000 warriors arranged for battle, their weapons glinting and their battle cries echoing across the plain, would have broken the resolve of many traditional enemies. But Judah, Pasha, and his men were not traditional enemies. They had crossed the Sahara precisely because they possessed weapons and tactics that could overcome numerical inferiority. The Moroccan commander, surveying the Songhai host with the eye of a professional soldier, gave the orders that would echo through African history. The first cannon shot of the Battle of Tundibi thundered across the Niger bend like the voice of a new age announcing its arrival. The iron ball, propelled by carefully measured charges of gunpowder, crashed into the Songhai ranks with effects that went far beyond the physical damage it inflicted. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Horses reared and plunged in terror at sounds they had never heard, their riders struggling to maintain control as the very foundations of their military world seemed to crumble. The arquebusiers followed the cannon's lead, their weapons speaking in a deadly chorus that sent bullets whistling through air thick with gunpowder smoke. The precise volleys that European military drill had perfected proved their effectiveness against formations designed for different forms of warfare. Songhai warriors, brave as they were, found themselves facing enemies who could kill at distances their own weapons could not match. Yet the battle was not decided by firepower alone. At the crucial moment, when Songhai courage and numbers seemed capable of overcoming Moroccan technology, fate intervened in a form that no military manual could have predicted. A herd of cattle, terrified by the sounds of gunfire and driven to panic by the smoke and confusion of battle, stampeded directly through the Songhai ranks at the moment when their cavalry was preparing its decisive charge. The stampede transformed an already confused situation into complete chaos. Horses and cattle, warriors and beasts, became inextricably mixed in a melee that destroyed any possibility of coordinated military action. The careful formations that represented centuries of military development dissolved into individual struggles for survival. In the dust and confusion, the Songhai army's numerical advantages became meaningless. Judah, Pasha, demonstrating the tactical flexibility that had made him a successful general, immediately recognized and exploited the opportunity that chance had provided. The Moroccan arquebusiers advanced through the confusion, their disciplined ranks maintaining formation while their enemies struggled with panicked animals and their own disrupted formations. The cannons continued their deadly work, each shot carefully aimed to maximize the confusion and terror that was rapidly spreading through the Songhai host. Askia, Ishakdur, witnessing the dissolution of his army from his position of command, faced the most difficult decision any ruler can confront: whether to continue a battle that was clearly lost or to preserve what forces remained for future resistance. The choice was made for him as his own commanders, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, began ordering retreats that quickly became routes. The retreat from Tundabi became a tragedy that compounded the disaster of the battle itself. An army that had advanced in good order and high spirits found itself fleeing in panic across terrain that offered little refuge from pursuit. The Niger River, which had been viewed as a potential line of retreat, became, instead, a trap as desperate warriors attempted to cross waters that claimed many lives even without enemy action. The Moroccan pursuit was methodical rather than vindictive, reflecting Judah Pasha's understanding that his small army could not afford unnecessary losses even in victory. Yet the psychological effects of the pursuit were devastating for Songhai morale. Warriors who had never known defeat in traditional warfare found themselves helpless before enemies armed with weapons that seemed to make conventional bravery irrelevant. As the sun set on March 13, 1591, the political landscape of West Africa had been permanently altered. The Songhai Empire, which had seemed invincible in the morning, lay broken on the field of Tondabi. The last great indigenous empire of medieval Africa had fallen not to superior numbers or greater courage, but to the inexorable advance of military technology and the economic pressures that drove men to use that technology against their neighbors. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the broader implications of what had occurred. This was not merely a change of dynasty or the substitution of one ruling class for another. It represented the intrusion of a new age into West Africa, an age in which European technology would increasingly determine the outcomes of African conflicts, an age in which the ancient patterns of trade and diplomacy would be disrupted by the demands of global economics. In the days following Tindabi, the Niger River carried more than its usual burden of silt and seasonal debris. The waters that had witnessed the rise of three great empires, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, now reflected the smoke of a dying age as Judah Pasha's victorious army advanced toward the cities that had embodied West African civilization for centuries. Timbuktu, the fabled city of gold and learning, received the news of Tundabi's outcome with the resigned fatalism of a community that had survived many changes of political fortune. The city's inhabitants, scholars and merchants, craftsmen and common laborers, understood that their world was about to undergo a transformation as profound as any in their collective memory. Yet few could have imagined the specific forms that this transformation would take. The approach of the Moroccan army created a crisis of identity for Timbuktu's Islamic community. Here was a Muslim army led by men who claimed to serve the same God and follow the same prophet as themselves, yet coming as conquerors rather than brothers. The scholars of Sanka University, whose learning had made Timbuktu famous throughout the Islamic world, found themselves confronting questions that their extensive libraries could not answer. How should Muslims respond to conquest by fellow Muslims? What obligations did Islamic law create in such circumstances? These theological debates became academic when the Moroccan forces entered Timbuktu in April 1591, the city that had been described by Leo Africanus as one of the wonders of Africa surrendered without resistance, its leaders calculating that submission offered better prospects for survival than futile defiance. Yet submission did not guarantee protection, as the city's inhabitants soon discovered. The sack of Timbuktu marked one of the greatest cultural catastrophes in African history. The Moroccan soldiers, motivated by months of hardship in crossing the Sahara and promises of wealth in the Sudan, saw the city's riches as legitimate spoils of war. The famous libraries that had made Timbuktu a center of Islamic learning throughout the medieval period suffered devastating losses as manuscripts were destroyed or carried away as curiosities. The destruction went beyond mere looting. It represented the disruption of networks of scholarship and trade that had developed over centuries. The scholars who had made Timbuktu famous fled or were killed. The trade connections that had brought wealth from across Africa and beyond were severed as the city's commercial infrastructure collapsed under the weight of foreign occupation. Within months, the Timbuktu that had amazed visitors from Cairo to Cordoba had become a shadow of its former self. Gen, the other great commercial center of the empire, suffered a similar fate when the Moroccan forces arrived at its gates. The city that had withstood Sonni Ali's 7-year siege fell to Judah Pasha in a matter of days. Its defenses overwhelmed by the same combination of firepower and terror that had proved decisive at Tondabi. The great mosque of Gen, with its distinctive architectural style that had influenced building throughout West Africa, survived the conquest but found itself serving a community diminished by war and foreign rule. The fall of Gen completed the destruction of Songhai's economic foundation. The city had served as a crucial link between the Niger river system and the overland trade routes that connected West Africa to North Africa and beyond. Its markets had been the meeting place, where gold from the south met salt from the north, where ivory and slaves were exchanged for horses and manufactured goods. The disruption of these trade networks sent economic shockwaves throughout the region. Gao, the imperial capital, presented Judah Pasha with his greatest challenge and opportunity. Unlike Timbuktu and Gen, which were primarily commercial centers, Gao was the political heart of the empire, the seat of the Askia dynasty, and the symbol of Songhai power. Its capture would complete the destruction of Songhai as a political entity, yet its wealth was also correspondingly greater than that of the other cities. The approach to Gao in May 1591 revealed the thoroughness of Songhai's collapse. Askia Ishakdua, the last emperor, had fled southward into the Dendi region rather than attempt to defend his capital. The city's defenses, formidable as they were, could not be effectively manned without the imperial army that had been shattered. At Tendibi, the great palace complex that had been the center of West African power for over a century stood virtually undefended. The capture of Gao provided the Moroccans with their greatest prize in terms of both material wealth and symbolic victory. The imperial treasury, accumulated over generations of Askia rule, fell into Judah Pasha's hands virtually intact. Gold in various forms, dust, nuggets, and worked ornaments provided immediate validation for the enormous expense of the Sahel expedition. More importantly, from a political perspective, the capture of the capital announced to the world that the Songhai Empire had ceased to exist as an effective political entity. Yet the very completeness of the Moroccan victory contained the seeds of its own limitations. Judah Pasha commanded only 4,000 men, a force adequate for defeating the Songhai army in pitched battle, but wholly insufficient for controlling a territory that stretched across much of West Africa. The cities could be occupied, but the countryside remained largely beyond Moroccan control. Moreover, the destruction of Songhai's political and economic infrastructure made it impossible to extract the wealth needed to maintain such an extensive occupation. The immediate aftermath of conquest revealed other problems that would plague Moroccan rule throughout its brief existence. The soldiers who had crossed the Sahara expected rewards commensurate with their achievements and sacrifices. Yet the wealth they had seized, impressive as it was, had to be divided among thousands of men while also providing for the continued military occupation of the conquered territories. The result was a constant tension between the need to satisfy the army and the requirement to establish stable governance. More fundamentally, the Moroccan conquest faced the problem that had challenged every foreign attempt to rule the Sudan. The region was simply too large and diverse to be effectively controlled from a single center, particularly by occupying forces from outside the region. The ethnic and linguistic diversity that had been a source of strength for indigenous empires became a source of weakness for foreign rulers, who lacked the cultural knowledge and political connections necessary for effective governance. The religious character of the occupation created additional complications. While both conquerors and conquered were Muslim, they represented different traditions within Islam and different approaches to the relationship between religious and secular authority. The Moroccan emphasis on orthodox Sunni practices often conflicted with the syncretic traditions that had developed in West Africa over centuries of Islamic expansion. Economic problems compounded political difficulties. The trans-Saharan trade routes that had been the foundation of West African prosperity were disrupted by the conquest itself. Merchants who had operated within stable political frameworks found themselves dealing with military occupation and uncertain legal systems. The result was a decline in commercial activity that reduced the very wealth the Moroccans had come to seize. Environmental factors also worked against the occupying forces. The Sahel's climate, challenging enough for indigenous populations adapted to its rhythms, proved particularly difficult for Moroccan soldiers accustomed to Mediterranean conditions. Disease took a heavy toll among the occupying forces, while the logistical challenges of maintaining supply lines across the Sahara proved nearly insurmountable by the end of 1591. Less than a year after the triumph at Tondabi, the limitations of Moroccan rule were becoming apparent. The great cities had been captured and looted, but effective governance remained elusive. The wealth that had motivated the invasion was proving difficult to extract on a sustainable basis. Most ominously for the long-term success of the occupation, resistance was beginning to emerge in regions that Moroccan forces could not effectively control, in the southern reaches of what had once been the Songhai Empire. In the region known as Dendi, where the Niger River curved through lands that would one day be called Niger, Askia Ishak too attempted to rebuild what had been shattered at Tendabi. The last emperor of Songhai had escaped the destruction of his capital, but he carried with him only the remnants of imperial authority and a burning desire to restore what had been lost. The Dendi region, with its mix of river valleys and savanna uplands, offered certain advantages for resistance against Moroccan occupation. Its distance from the main centers of Moroccan power made it difficult for Judah Pasha's forces to project their military superiority effectively. The terrain favored defensive warfare, particularly the guerrilla tactics that would become necessary, given the disparity in conventional military capabilities between the two sides. More importantly, the Dendi retained the loyalties of populations that had never fully accepted the legitimacy of Moroccan rule. The traditional structures of Songhai society, the networks of kinship and clientage that had bound together the empire's diverse populations remained intact in these southern regions. Chiefs and nobles who had fled the occupation of the northern cities brought with them not only their personal retinues, but also their claims to legitimate authority. The resistance that emerged in Dendi and other peripheral regions of the former empire represented more than mere political opposition to foreign rule. It embodied a cultural struggle for the preservation of West African traditions in the face of external conquest. The Songhai way of life, its blend of Islamic and traditional African elements, its distinctive approaches to governance and commerce, its particular forms of social organization, all of these were threatened by the homogenizing effects of Moroccan occupation. Islamic efforts to organize resistance faced enormous challenges from the outset. The military defeat at Tundubi had not only destroyed the Imperial army, but had also shattered the confidence of potential supporters in the possibility of successful resistance. The demonstration of Moroccan military superiority, particularly in the use of firearms, had convinced many that opposition was futile. Yet the Askia persevered, drawing upon reservoirs of loyalty and tradition that the Moroccans had not fully appreciated. The legitimacy that came from dynastic succession, from religious sanction, from cultural continuity, of these provided foundations for resistance that mere military superiority could not easily destroy. Local communities that might have accepted foreign rule as a temporary necessity gradually began to see continued resistance as a religious and cultural obligation. The warfare that developed in the aftermath of the Moroccan conquest differed fundamentally from the conventional battles that had characterized earlier West African conflicts. Unable to match Moroccan firepower in direct confrontation, the resistance adopted tactics of harassment and attrition. Small bands of warriors struck at Moroccan supply lines, attacked isolated garrisons, and then melted back into familiar terrain before reinforcements could arrive. These guerrilla tactics proved particularly effective against an occupying force that was already stretched thin across a vast territory. Judah Pasha's army, formidable as it had been in conventional battle, found itself fighting an enemy that refused to present clear targets for cannons and arquebuses. The mobility that had allowed the Moroccans to cross the Sahara became a liability when they needed to defend fixed positions against attacks that could come from any direction. The resistance also drew strength from the economic disruption that Moroccan rule had created. The trans-Saharan trade that had provided the wealth to motivate the invasion in the first place began to decline as political instability made commercial ventures increasingly risky. Merchants who had once moved freely along established routes now faced the constant threat of attack by resistance forces who viewed commerce with the occupiers as collaboration. Environmental factors that had initially favored the resistance began to work against the Moroccans as well. The annual cycle of seasons in the Sahel, with its alternation between wet and dry periods, created logistical challenges that the occupying forces were ill-equipped to handle. Supply lines that stretched across the Sahara became increasingly unreliable as the costs and risks of maintaining them grew exponentially. The death of Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur in Morocco in 1603 removed one of the primary sources of support for the West African adventure. His successors, faced with their own political and economic challenges in North Africa, were increasingly reluctant to commit resources to maintaining distant conquests that had failed to generate the expected returns. The soldiers in the Sudan found themselves increasingly isolated, dependent on their own efforts to maintain their position. This isolation led to a gradual transformation in the character of Moroccan rule. Unable to rely on reinforcements from Morocco, the occupying forces began to adapt to local conditions in ways that their original mission had not anticipated. Intermarriage with local populations created new networks of kinship and obligation. Economic necessity forced accommodation with local trading networks. Political reality required negotiation with traditional authorities who had initially been viewed as enemies to be eliminated. The result was the emergence of what historians would later call the Pashalik of Timbuktu, a hybrid political entity that combined Moroccan claims to authority with practical accommodation to West African realities. The pashas who ruled this entity bore Moroccan titles and maintained nominal allegiance to the Sultan in Marrakesh, but their actual power depended on their ability to work within existing African political and social structures. Yet even this adaptive form of rule faced constant challenges from the continuing resistance based in Dendi and other peripheral regions. Askia Ishakdua, though never able to restore the full extent of Songhai power, maintained sufficient strength to prevent complete Moroccan consolidation of their conquest. His successors continued this resistance well into the 17th century, ensuring that the Moroccan occupation remained partial and contested throughout its existence. The long resistance also had profound cultural consequences that extended far beyond its immediate political effects. The struggle to maintain Songhai independence became a vehicle for preserving and transmitting cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost under foreign rule. Epic poems celebrating the deeds of Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad found new relevance as symbols of resistance to foreign domination. Traditional ceremonies and festivals took on new meaning as expressions of cultural identity in the face of external pressure. The scholarly tradition that had made Timbuktu famous throughout the Islamic world, though severely damaged by the conquest, survived in reduced form through the efforts of scholars who preserved manuscripts and maintained teaching despite the disruption of their institutions. Some of these scholars fled to areas under resistance control, where they continued their work under the protection of the Dendi Askias. Others remained in the occupied cities but worked covertly to preserve knowledge that the occupiers either ignored or actively suppressed. Religious practice also became a form of resistance as communities maintained traditions that differed from the orthodox interpretations favored by the Moroccan authorities. The syncretic Islam that had characterized Songhai religious life, with its accommodation of traditional African elements, persisted in areas beyond direct Moroccan control and even influenced practices in the occupied regions. As the 17th century progressed, the failure of the Moroccan occupation to achieve its original objectives became increasingly apparent. The wealth that had motivated the invasion proved elusive, depleted by the costs of maintaining military occupation and disrupted by the resistance that made normal economic activity impossible. The political control that was supposed to have been established remained partial and contested, requiring constant military effort to maintain. More fundamentally, the conquest had failed to create the kind of stable, prosperous colony that might have justified its enormous costs. Instead of integrating the Sudan into a Moroccan empire that would dominate trans-Saharan trade, the invasion had disrupted the very economic networks that had made the region valuable in the first place. The result was a Pyrrhic victory that weakened both conqueror and conquered without creating sustainable benefits for either. Time, that most patient of conquerors, began its inexorable work upon the Moroccan occupation of the Sudan as the 17th century wore on. The grand vision that had motivated Ahmad al-Mansour's invasion, the creation of a trans-Saharan empire that would restore Morocco's finances and extend its power deep into Africa, gradually gave way to the harsh realities of governing a vast, diverse, and resistant territory with insufficient resources and declining support from the homeland. The transformation of the occupation from a military conquest to a precarious colonial administration reflected broader changes in the Mediterranean world and the Islamic political order. Morocco itself faced new challenges as European powers continued their expansion along the African coast, disrupting traditional patterns of trade and diplomacy. The resources that might have been used to consolidate control over the Sudan were increasingly needed to defend Morocco's own territories against external pressure. In the cities of the Sudan, the Moroccan pashas, who had replaced the Askia administration, found themselves governing communities that remained fundamentally alien to their understanding and experience. Timbuktu, once the jewel of West African Islamic civilization, struggled to maintain its commercial and intellectual functions under rulers who viewed it primarily as a source of revenue rather than a center of culture worthy of preservation and development. The decline was gradual but unmistakable. The great libraries that had made Timbuktu famous throughout the Islamic world continued to suffer losses as manuscripts were dispersed, destroyed, or simply allowed to deteriorate through neglect. The scholarly community that had created and maintained these intellectual treasures found itself without the patronage and security necessary to continue its work at previous levels of excellence. Trade, the lifeblood of the Sudanese cities, adapted to the new political realities but never fully recovered its former vitality. The disruption of established commercial networks, combined with the ongoing resistance in peripheral regions, made long-distance trade increasingly risky and expensive. Merchants who had once moved freely across vast territories now found their activities constrained by political boundaries and military necessities. The demographic consequences of the conquest and its aftermath became increasingly apparent as the 17th century progressed. War, disease, and economic disruption had taken their toll on urban populations that had been the foundation of Sudanese civilization. Rural areas, while less directly affected by the conquest itself, suffered from the breakdown of the political and economic systems that had provided stability and security. Perhaps most significantly, the disruption of traditional systems of education and cultural transmission began to have cumulative effects that would reshape West African society for generations to come. The institutions that had preserved and transmitted knowledge from Islamic universities to traditional craft guilds found their continuity broken by the political upheavals of the conquest period in the Dendi region. The remnants of the Askia dynasty continued their resistance, but this too began to show the effects of prolonged struggle against superior military technology. The successors of Ishak II found themselves ruling increasingly restricted territories with diminishing resources, yet their persistence served important functions beyond immediate military resistance, providing symbols of legitimacy and continuity that would influence the region's political development long after the Moroccan occupation had ended. The gradual weakening of Moroccan control created opportunities for the emergence of new political entities throughout the former Songhai territories. Local chiefs and strongmen, some claiming descent from the old imperial nobility, others representing entirely new political formations, began to assert independence from both Moroccan authority and the claims of the Dendi Askias. This political fragmentation reflected deeper social and economic changes that were transforming the entire region. The centralized empire that had characterized West African political organization since the time of Ghana was giving way to a more decentralized system of competing kingdoms and city-states. While this fragmentation reduced the region's ability to resist external pressure, it also demonstrated the resilience of African political traditions in adapting to changed circumstances. The role of Islamic identity in these political developments proved complex and sometimes contradictory. While Islam continued to provide a common framework for cultural and political identity throughout the region, the experience of conquest by fellow Muslims had complicated simple appeals to religious solidarity. Different communities and political entities developed varying interpretations of what Islamic identity meant in the context of resistance to foreign rule. Environmental factors also contributed to the changing political landscape of the Sudan. The climate fluctuations that affected the Sahel during this period, including extended droughts that disrupted agricultural production and changed the patterns of seasonal migration that had shaped the region's economy, created additional stresses on political systems already weakened by conquest and resistance. The Atlantic trade that was beginning to develop along the West African coast introduced new economic opportunities and challenges that further undermined the traditional trans-Saharan networks that had been the foundation of Sudanese prosperity. European merchants operating from coastal bases offered alternative markets for African products and alternative sources for manufactured goods, reducing the dependence on North African trade routes that had made the conquest of the Sudan attractive to Morocco in the first place. By the middle of the 17th century, the Moroccan occupation of the Sudan had evolved into something very different from what its original architects had envisioned. Instead of a profitable colony that would restore Morocco's financial strength, the occupation had become a drain on resources that contributed to Morocco's own political and economic difficulties. Instead of extending Moroccan power into the heart of Africa, the conquest had created a frontier that required constant military attention without providing compensating benefits. The Pashas who governed Timbuktu and the other occupied cities found themselves increasingly isolated from Morocco and increasingly dependent on local accommodation to maintain their positions. Some married into local families, creating new networks of kinship and obligation that tied them to the communities they governed. Others adopted local customs and traditions that their predecessors would have rejected as incompatible with Moroccan identity. This process of cultural adaptation worked both ways, as local populations also adapted to the presence of Moroccan authority, new forms of architecture, new styles of dress, new approaches to administration. Of these reflected the ongoing interaction between Moroccan and Sudanese traditions. Yet these adaptations occurred within a context of fundamental political instability that prevented the emergence of stable new cultural syntheses. The continuing resistance in the peripheral regions ensured that the Moroccan occupation never achieved the kind of comprehensive control that might have enabled deeper cultural integration. The Askias, though reduced in power and territory, continued to represent an alternative focus of loyalty that prevented complete acceptance of Moroccan authority. Other resistance movements, some claiming religious sanction, others based on ethnic or regional identity, maintained pressure on the occupation throughout its existence. As the 17th century progressed toward its end, the question was no longer whether Moroccan rule in the Sudan would survive, but rather what would replace it when it finally collapsed. The old Songhai Empire could not be restored in its original form, both because its institutional foundations had been destroyed, and because the conditions that had made its existence possible had changed. Yet the search for new forms of political organization that could provide stability and prosperity for the peoples of the Sudan continued throughout the region. As the 18th century dawned across the bend of the Niger River, the great cities that had once embodied the power and glory of Songhai stood as monuments to transformation and loss. Timbuktu, though still bearing the name that had once inspired wonder from Cairo to Cordoba, was no longer the vibrant center of learning and commerce that had defined medieval West Africa. Gao, stripped of its imperial palaces and administrative apparatus, continued to exist as a trading post, but the political authority that had once emanated from its walls had dispersed, like smoke in the Sahel wind, the Morocco that had conquered these cities with such fanfare and such promise of wealth found itself unable to maintain the vision that had motivated the original invasion. The Pashas, who governed in the Sultan's name, were increasingly local figures, their authority dependent on accommodation with African realities rather than enforcement of Moroccan will. The dream of a trans-Saharan empire had given way to the practicalities of survival in an environment that remained fundamentally alien to North African understanding. Yet the story of Songhai's fall and Morocco's partial conquest represents more than the rise and decline of particular political entities. It embodies the broader transformation of Africa during the early modern period, as traditional patterns of trade and political organization encountered the disruptive forces of technological change, religious reform, and global economic integration. The arquebuses that thundered at Tundubi were harbingers of changes that would reshape not only West Africa but the entire continent in the centuries that followed. The cultural consequences of this transformation proved more lasting than its immediate political effects. The scholarly tradition that had made Timbuktu famous throughout the Islamic world, though severely damaged, did not entirely disappear. Manuscripts were hidden in private homes, passed down through families, preserved in desert caches where they waited for more favorable times. The knowledge they contained, spanning subjects from astronomy and mathematics to law and literature, survived as testimony to the intellectual achievements of medieval Africa. In the Dendi region, the descendants of the last Askias continued to maintain claims to imperial authority, long after effective power had been reduced to purely local significance. These claims served important symbolic functions, providing links to a past when African political entities had commanded respect throughout the known world. The rituals and ceremonies associated with Askia rule, though performed in reduced circumstances, preserved memories of imperial grandeur that would influence later attempts at political reconstruction. The linguistic legacy of the empire also endured in ways that transcended political boundaries. Songhai, the language of the ruling elite, continued to be spoken throughout the Niger Bend region, carrying within its vocabulary and grammar the concepts and categories that had structured imperial administration. Trade languages that had developed to facilitate commerce across the empire's vast territories remained in use, testament to the commercial networks that had once bound West Africa together. Religious developments in the post-conquest period reflected the complex interaction between Islamic orthodoxy and African tradition that had characterized Songhai rule. The forms of Islam that emerged in different parts of the former empire varied considerably, some emphasizing strict adherence to Middle Eastern models, others maintaining the syncretic traditions that had allowed Islamic and traditional African elements to coexist. These variations would provide the foundation for later reform movements that sought to purify or restore Islamic practice in West Africa. The economic transformation of the region proved equally complex and lasting. The disruption of trans-Saharan trade routes that had followed the Moroccan conquest was compounded by the growth of Atlantic commerce, which offered alternative outlets for African products and alternative sources for imported goods. The result was a gradual reorientation of African economies toward the coast, a process that would have profound implications for the continent's subsequent development. This economic reorientation was accompanied by demographic changes that reflected the new realities of African political and economic life. Urban populations that had been sustained by trans-Saharan commerce declined as trade routes shifted. Rural populations adapted to new agricultural techniques and crops, some introduced by Moroccan conquerors, others developing from contact with Atlantic traders. The result was a transformation of African society that extended far beyond the immediate effects of political conquest. The military revolution that had enabled the Moroccan conquest of Songhai continued to influence African political development long after the specific circumstances of the invasion had passed. Firearms gradually spread throughout West Africa, changing the nature of warfare and the balance of power between different political entities. The cavalry forces that had dominated medieval African battlefields were forced to adapt to new tactical realities, while infantry forces armed with muskets assumed new importance. These military changes had social as well as political implications. The warrior aristocracies that had dominated traditional African societies found their military advantages reduced by the democratizing effects of firearms. At the same time, the costs of acquiring and maintaining firearms created new forms of economic pressure that influenced political development throughout the region. The environmental context within which these changes occurred also influenced their specific forms and consequences. The Sahel's climate, with its cycles of drought and plenty, continued to shape the possibilities for political and economic development. Communities that had adapted to these environmental rhythms over centuries found themselves forced to accommodate new political and economic pressures, while maintaining their fundamental relationship with the land. Climate change during this period, including the global cooling that marked the Little Ice Age, may have contributed to the political instability that made the Moroccan conquest possible in the first place. Reduced rainfall in the Sahel would have stressed agricultural systems and disrupted the pastoral activities that supported many of the region's populations. These environmental pressures, combined with the political conflicts that characterized the later Askia period, created vulnerabilities that external conquerors could exploit. The intellectual tradition that had flourished under Songhai rule faced particular challenges in adapting to the changed circumstances of the post-conquest period. Islamic scholarship, which had reached remarkable heights in medieval Timbuktu, struggled to maintain its excellence without the institutional support and political protection that imperial patronage had provided. Yet scholars found ways to continue their work, often under private patronage or through networks that transcended political boundaries. The historical writing that emerged from this period reflects both the trauma of conquest and the determination to preserve memory of better times. Chronicles like the Tariq al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatash, compiled during the 17th century, represent attempts to record the achievements of the medieval empires for posterity. These works, written from the perspective of conquered peoples, provide invaluable insights into African historical consciousness and the ways in which communities remembered and interpreted their past. The artistic traditions that had flourished under imperial patronage also faced challenges in the post-conquest period, but demonstrated remarkable resilience in adapting to new circumstances. Architecture, textiles, metalwork, and other forms of artistic expression continued to develop, though often in reduced circumstances. The distinctive styles that had emerged during the imperial period influenced artistic development throughout West Africa. Even as political boundaries changed and imperial unity gave way to local autonomy, perhaps most importantly, the story of Songhai's rise and fall became part of the collective memory of West African peoples, providing a framework for understanding their place in history and their relationship to the wider world. The empire's achievements in trade and diplomacy, in military organization and administrative efficiency, in scholarship and cultural development served as models for later political movements that sought to restore African political unity and cultural achievement. The memory of resistance, particularly the long struggle waged by the Dendi Askias against Moroccan occupation, provided inspiration for later movements that sought to resist foreign domination. The fact that African political entities had successfully governed vast territories and commanded international respect challenged narratives that depicted Africans as naturally suited for subordination to external authority. These memories would prove particularly important during the colonial period, when European powers sought to establish direct control over African territories. The example of Songhai demonstrated that Africans were capable of creating and maintaining sophisticated political systems, that African cultures had produced remarkable intellectual and artistic achievements, and that African resistance to foreign domination had deep historical roots. As the 18th century progressed, the immediate effects of the Moroccan conquest began to fade into history, but its longer-term consequences continued to shape West African development. The political fragmentation that had followed the empire's collapse created new opportunities for local innovation and adaptation, even as it reduced the region's ability to resist external pressure. The economic changes that had begun with the disruption of trans-Saharan trade continued to evolve, ultimately contributing to West Africa's integration into global commercial networks. The religious and cultural transformations that had begun during the Imperial period and accelerated during the conquest continued to influence West African society in complex ways. Islam remained a powerful force for cultural unity, even as political unity proved elusive. Traditional African religious and cultural practices maintained their vitality, often in creative synthesis with Islamic elements. The result was a rich cultural landscape that reflected both continuity with the past and adaptation to changing circumstances. In the end, the story of the Songhai Empire and its conquest by Morocco represents a crucial chapter in the larger story of African engagement with the wider world. It demonstrates both the achievements that African societies could attain when conditions were favorable and the vulnerabilities that could lead to their downfall when those conditions changed. Most importantly, it reveals the resilience and creativity with which African peoples responded to the challenges of historical change, preserving what could be preserved while adapting what needed to be adapted. The winds that blow across the Niger Bend today carry within them the dust of civilizations that rose and fell along these ancient waters. The great cities remain, their names still echoing with the memory of former glory, their populations still carrying forward traditions that stretch back through centuries of triumph and tragedy. The empire that Sunni Ali forged and Askia Muhammad perfected lives are not in political institutions that have long since crumbled, but in the enduring human capacity to create meaning and beauty. Even in the face of loss and transformation, and in the silence of desert nights, when the stars shine down upon the same rivers and trade routes that witness the passage of kings and scholars, merchants and warriors, the story continues to unfold. For history is not merely the record of what has been, but the foundation upon which what will be is built. The empire of Songhai, in all its glory and all its tragedy, remains part of that foundation, its legacy woven into the continuing story of human civilization in the heart of Africa. Beneath layers of time and sand, the echoes still whisper there. Ancient songs, songs of triumph and loss, of wisdom and folly, of the eternal human struggle to build something lasting in a world where all things pass away. The Niger flows on, as it has for millennia, carrying within its waters the memory of all who have lived and died along its banks, all who have built and destroyed, all who have dreamed of empire in the endless conversation between desert and river, between past and future, between what was and what might yet be in the end. Perhaps this is the truest legacy of Songhai, not the gold that was spent or the cities that fell, but the demonstration that human societies, however humble their origins, can rise to heights of achievement that command the respect of the world. That Africans, no less than any other people, have created works of lasting beauty and value. That the story of human civilization is incomplete without the contributions of those who built their dreams along the banks of the Niger, who found in the marriage of desert and river a foundation for greatness that time itself cannot entirely destroy. The stars that witnessed Sunni Ali's conquests still shine above the Sahel. The river that carried Askia Muhammad's fleets still flows toward the sea, and somewhere in the vast silences of the African night, the spirit of empire lives on, not as political reality, but as human possibility, as testament to what can be achieved when vision and opportunity, courage and wisdom find their proper conjunction in the endless dance of history. If this journey through the rise and fall of empires has stirred something within you, consider subscribing to fall asleep to history. Let these timeless stories find their way into your dreams, where the past speaks to the present, and where the echoes of distant voices remind us that we too are part of history's great unfolding. Like, share, and subscribe for in remembering the past, we better understand our present, and in understanding our present, we better prepare for whatever future awaits us in the turning of time's eternal wheel.